Hey everybody, this is Sleepy Crime, and today I'm gonna help you. I know you want to fall asleep to this video, so before you do, put a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. By the way, where are you from and what time are you watching? Make yourself comfortable and relax. Rebecca Zahow was born on March 15, 1979, in Phalam, a town in the Chin state of western Myanmar. She was raised in a devoutly Christian family of Chin ethnicity, an ethnic minority that often faced religious and political persecution in their home country. In the 1990s, the Zahow family emigrated to the United States, seeking greater opportunities and safety. They eventually settled in Missouri, where Rebecca adapted to her new environment and completed her education. As a young adult, Zahow was described by those who knew her as intelligent, composed, and caring. She worked in the medical field, eventually becoming a certified ophthalmic technician. Rebecca moved frequently for work and personal reasons, living in places like Arizona and California over the years. Her devout religious beliefs remained a consistent and defining part of her identity throughout her life. Rebecca met Jonah Shacknai, the CEO and founder of a pharmaceutical company, Medicis, around 2008. The two began a relationship despite their significant age difference. Shacknai, a prominent businessman, had been married twice before and had 3 children from previous relationships. His youngest son, Maxfield Aaron Shacknai, or Max, was 6 years old in 2011. Over time, Rebecca grew close to Jonah's children, especially Max. She was seen as a caring and active presence in his life. By 2011, Rebecca had moved into Shacknai's historic oceanfront residence, the Spreckles Mansion in Coronado, California. The property, located near San Diego, was an expansive Mediterranean-style home, notable for both its size and prominence. It became a focal point of national attention later that year. By summer 2011, Jonah and Rebecca were navigating a complex family dynamic, balancing responsibilities as partners and caregivers. Rebecca's teenage sister, Zena, visited the mansion in early July to spend time with her. During this visit, the course of events would change drastically, culminating in one of the most scrutinized and controversial death investigations in recent American history. On July 11, 2011, a medical emergency was reported at the historic Spreckles Mansion in Coronado, California. At approximately 10:10 a.m., a 911 call was placed by Rebecca Zahow, reporting that 6-year-old Max Shacknai had been injured. Rebecca had been the only adult present in the house at the time, along with her visiting teenage sister, Zena Zahow. According to initial reports, Max had been playing near a second-floor landing outside a bedroom when he somehow fell over the banister, approximately 9 feet, to the floor below. His scooter was found nearby, leading some to speculate whether he had been riding it at the time of the fall. When paramedics arrived, they found Max unconscious, not breathing, and with injuries that included facial abrasions and brain trauma. He was rushed to Rady Children's Hospital in San Diego. Rebecca told authorities she had heard a noise and found Max lying on the floor. She stated that she immediately began CPR and called 911. Zena, though present in the home, reportedly did not witness the fall. Investigators began gathering details, taking photographs of the scene, and collecting preliminary statements. Among the items documented were a soccer ball, a razor-type scooter, and scattered household objects in the entry area. Max's injuries were extensive. He suffered a spinal cord injury and brain damage consistent with a lack of oxygen. Despite intensive medical care, his condition deteriorated rapidly. Family members, including his father Jonah and mother Dinah, were notified and arrived at the hospital. The days following the accident were fraught with uncertainty. Max remained in a coma, showing no signs of improvement. Medical experts noted that his injuries, though consistent with a fall, raised questions due to their severity. As investigators continued reviewing the scene and collecting evidence, there was no public suggestion of foul play. Meanwhile, tensions rose among those close to the situation. Emotions ran high as the reality of Max's critical condition set in. Jonah Shacknai remained at his son's bedside, with other family members joining him at the hospital. Rebecca and Zaina returned to the mansion, where they stayed in the following days. Max Shacknai was pronounced dead on July 16, 2011. The cause of death was ruled as complications from blunt force trauma sustained in the fall. The manner of death was initially listed as accidental, but even before this official determination, another, more shocking event would take place inside the Spreckels mansion, just 2 days after Max's accident, thrusting the property and its occupants into a national spotlight. In the early morning hours of July 13, 2011, just 2 days after Max Shacknai's accident, Adam Shacknai, Jonah Shacknai's brother, discovered the body of Rebecca Zahow at the Spreckels mansion. Adam, who had flown in from Memphis on July 12th to support his brother during Max's hospitalization, was staying in the mansion's guest house. At approximately 6:45 a.m., Adam called 911 to report a suicide. He told the dispatcher that he had found Rebecca hanging from a balcony on the second floor. According to his account, he used a knife to cut her down and attempted to perform CPR while awaiting emergency responders. Paramedics arrived at the scene shortly thereafter and confirmed that Rebecca was deceased. The scene was immediately secured by the Coronado Police Department, with the San Diego County Sheriff's Department taking over the investigation soon after. Investigators documented that Rebecca was found nude, with her wrists and ankles bound by red nautical rope. Her hands were tied behind her back, and a blue long-sleeve t-shirt was wrapped around her neck and stuffed into her mouth as a gag. The balcony from which she was hanging was adjacent to a guest bedroom. Nearby, investigators found a cryptic message painted in black on a door. "She saved him, can you save her?" The meaning and authorship of the message became central to the investigation. Adam Shacknai told investigators he had not heard any disturbances overnight, and had only discovered Rebecca's body when he stepped outside in the morning. The discovery of a bound and gagged woman hanging from a balcony immediately sparked widespread speculation and public concern. Yet, from the outset, investigators considered the possibility of suicide. Officials conducted interviews with those present at the mansion, including Adam and Zena, who had returned home the previous day. Rebecca's phone records, computer activity, and emails were reviewed. A message she had reportedly received the night before from Jonah informing her of Max's worsening condition was considered potentially significant. Authorities examined whether guilt or emotional distress may have contributed to her death. An autopsy conducted later that day reported the cause of death as asphyxia due to hanging. The forensic pathologist noted the presence of 4 hemorrhages in the scalp, injuries on the back of her head, and bruising on her arms and legs. Toxicology results indicated no alcohol or drugs in her system. Despite the unusual bindings, investigators stated the knots could be self-applied and maintained their conclusion that Rebecca's death was a suicide. The ruling did little to quell public interest or growing skepticism. Family members, particularly Rebecca's sister Mary and brother-in-law Doug, voiced doubts over the official narrative. They questioned how Rebecca could have physically bound herself and why such a message was left behind. As law enforcement concluded its preliminary findings, the Zahow family began seeking outside expertise. A storm of media attention followed, and debate over the circumstances of Rebecca Zahau's death only intensified. Following the discovery of Rebecca Zahau's body on July 13, 2011, the San Diego County Sheriff's Department launched a full investigation. The circumstances, nude, bound, and gagged, led to intense public interest and speculation. Yet, from the outset, investigators stated there was no evidence of foul play. Authorities conducted forensic examinations of the mansion, reviewed physical evidence, and reconstructed the timeline of events. They found no signs of forced entry, struggle, or defensive wounds. The bindings on Zahau's wrists and ankles were studied by crime scene analysts, who concluded that the rope knots could feasibly have been self-tied, despite their unusual placement. Investigators recreated scenarios to demonstrate this possibility, suggesting that Rebecca could have used a series of loops and knots to restrain herself before hanging from the balcony. The message found on the bedroom door, "She saved him, can you save her?" was analyzed for handwriting, but no conclusive match was made. Investigators were unable to determine with certainty who wrote it. Fingerprint and DNA analysis on the rope, knife, and other objects yielded partial results, but none directly implicated another person. The autopsy conducted by the San Diego County Medical Examiner noted that the cause of death was asphyxia due to hanging. The report described symmetrical neck ligature furrows and found no evidence of sexual assault. The presence of tape residue on her legs and bruises on her body raised questions, but the pathologist concluded that they could be consistent with a fall or with the act of hanging itself. Ligature furrow depth and positioning also supported the hanging mechanism. On September 2, 2011, the Sheriff's Department held a press conference to announce its findings. Sheriff Bill Gore declared the death of Rebecca Zahau to be a suicide. He cited the absence of physical evidence pointing to an intruder, and the psychological profile developed from Rebecca's texts and internet history, which showed she was reportedly distraught about Max's condition. Authorities emphasized that Adam Shacknai passed a polygraph test, and no physical evidence placed him or anyone else at the scene of the hanging. His 911 call was played during the press briefing, reinforcing the official version of events. Law enforcement stated that Rebecca's death was not related to Max's accident, despite the timing and emotional impact. Public reactions were polarized. Critics argued that the physical improbability of the bindings, the gag, and the strange message indicated possible foul play. The Zahau family vocally disputed the suicide ruling, claiming that Rebecca would not have taken her own life, particularly in such a dramatic and public way. They hired independent pathologist Dr. Cyril Voigt, who questioned the official conclusions, especially the possibility of self-binding and the head trauma. Nevertheless, the Sheriff's Department closed the case, stating all credible leads had been exhausted. With the case officially ruled a suicide, the Zahau family began considering civil legal action. The lack of charges and continued doubt about the circumstances ensured the case remained in the public eye. From the moment authorities ruled Rebecca Zahau's death a suicide, her family voiced strong disagreement. Rebecca's sister, Mary Zahau Lohner, and brother-in-law, Doug Lohner, emerged as vocal advocates for reopening the case. They described Rebecca as deeply religious and emotionally stable, arguing that the official explanation was inconsistent with her character and the evidence at the scene. To challenge the findings, the Zahau family commissioned their own investigations. Forensic pathologist Dr. Cyril Wecht reviewed the autopsy report and photographs, concluding that the pattern of head injuries and the bindings were not consistent with suicide. He raised concerns about 4 separate blunt force injuries to the back of Rebecca's head, questioning whether a fall alone could cause such trauma. Dr. Wecht also noted the improbability of a person gagging themselves with a shirt and binding their hands and feet in the manner found. Additionally, the family consulted crime scene analyst Dr. Werner Spitz, who similarly doubted that Rebecca could have self-inflicted the bindings. The experts highlighted inconsistencies, such as the lack of fingerprints on key objects, and the ambiguous nature of the painted message on the door. In the public sphere, media coverage of the case intensified. News outlets conducted interviews with family members, legal experts, and forensic consultants. The Zahau family launched a website and organized public petitions demanding a more thorough investigation. Their efforts drew national attention, with talk shows and documentary programs examining the unresolved questions surrounding the case. Frustrated by the lack of criminal charges, the Zahaus shifted focus to a civil case. In July 2013, they filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Adam Shacknai, alleging that he was responsible for Rebecca's death. The complaint accused Adam of assaulting and killing Rebecca in a sexually motivated act, then staging the scene to appear as a suicide. Adam Shacknai denied all allegations, calling the claims baseless and maintaining that he found Rebecca already deceased. His legal team sought to dismiss the suit, but the court allowed the case to proceed. The family's legal filings outlined a timeline they argued better fit the physical and forensic evidence. They cited Adam's proximity to the scene, the absence of his DNA from the bindings, and questions about the 911 call and his account of events. Over time, the case drew support from advocacy groups and members of the public who questioned the thoroughness of the original investigation. The Zahaus maintained that they were not driven by vengeance, but by a desire for truth and accountability. Their persistence kept the case in the public eye and laid the groundwork for a high-profile civil trial. While the sheriff's department stood by its original findings, it acknowledged the public interest and confirmed that all evidence had been reviewed. However, officials reiterated that no new evidence had emerged to justify reopening the case. As the civil proceedings moved forward, the family's pursuit of justice for Rebecca remained steadfast. In 2013, the Zahau family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Adam Shacknai, alleging that he had murdered Rebecca Zahau. They argued that evidence pointed not to suicide, but to a staged hanging meant to conceal a homicide. Though the burden of proof in a civil case is lower than in a criminal proceeding, the lawsuit drew sharp public scrutiny and intense media attention. After years of legal motions and delays, the case proceeded to trial in early 2018 in San Diego Superior Court. The Zahaus' legal team, led by attorney Keith Greer, laid out a theory that Adam Shacknai assaulted Rebecca in a sexually motivated act and then killed her. They argued that the bindings on her body, the cryptic message on the door, and the injuries she sustained were incompatible with suicide. Key testimony came from forensic experts. The plaintiffs called Dr. Rebecca Shu, a forensic pathologist, who testified that the injuries to Rebecca's head were consistent with multiple impacts and not easily explained by a hanging. She also stated that the manner of binding, especially hands tied behind her back, made a self-inflicted death highly unlikely. Additional testimony highlighted the lack of fingerprints on the rope and knife used to cut her down. Inconsistencies in the 911 call and questions about Adam's timeline and behavior. The defense, representing Adam Shacknai, maintained that Rebecca took her own life, driven by guilt and despair over Max Shacknai's accident. They noted that law enforcement had already ruled the death a suicide after extensive investigation. Adam Shacknai himself took the stand, stating under oath that he had no involvement in Rebecca's death and recounting how he discovered her body and attempted to render aid. His legal team emphasized the absence of physical evidence linking him to the bindings or the scene in a criminal sense. Throughout the trial, jurors were shown crime scene photos, reviewed Rebecca's emails and text messages, and listened to expert testimony on forensic reconstruction. The plaintiffs asserted that a sexually humiliating aspect to the hanging, nude, gagged, and bound strongly suggested foul play. They also questioned the logic of the suicide note on the door, calling it uncharacteristic of Rebecca's writing style. On April 4, 2018, after weeks of testimony and deliberations, the jury found Adam Shacknai responsible for the wrongful death of Rebecca Zahow. They awarded the Zahow family $5 million in damages. The verdict did not result in criminal charges, but it represented a significant legal and symbolic victory for the family, who had spent years challenging the official version of events. Adam Shacknai's legal team promptly filed motions to have the verdict set aside and to pursue a new trial. In 2019, both parties reached a settlement that included vacating the jury's verdict and dismissing the case with prejudice. The terms of the settlement were confidential, but the Zahow family stated that they remained committed to their belief that Rebecca had been murdered. Though the civil trial did not lead to criminal prosecution, it publicly re-examined the evidence and reignited questions about law enforcement's handling of the case. The courtroom became a forum for contrasting interpretations of the same set of facts, one rooted in suicide, the other in homicide. Following the civil trial's conclusion and the confidential 2019 settlement between Adam Shacknai and the Zahow family, public interest in Rebecca Zahow's death persisted. Despite the vacating of the wrongful death verdict, the trial had exposed conflicting interpretations of evidence that many found unresolved. The family continued to advocate for further investigation, insisting that the circumstances of Rebecca's death warranted criminal scrutiny. In 2019, buoyed by public support and ongoing media attention, the Zahow family formally requested that the San Diego County Sheriff's Department reopen the case. They submitted a petition supported by forensic findings presented during the civil trial, including expert analysis of Rebecca's injuries and the bindings. However, sheriff's officials reviewed the evidence and declined to change their original ruling. They stated that no new compelling information had been presented that would justify reopening the investigation. Meanwhile, legal observers and advocacy groups debated the implications of the case. The outcome of the civil suit, despite its later nullification, highlighted potential limitations in how suicides are investigated when unusual or complex elements are involved. It also raised broader questions about how police evaluate physical evidence and psychological factors in death cases. Public interest was further sustained through documentaries, true crime programs, and podcasts. The Zahow case was featured in multiple television specials, each presenting different perspectives on the events. These programs revisited key pieces of evidence, conducted interviews with family members and legal experts, and reviewed both the civil and criminal findings. While none introduced new evidence, they contributed to ongoing public discourse. Adam Shacknai continued to deny all allegations against him and criticized the civil proceedings as unjust. He maintained that his only involvement was in discovering Rebecca and attempting to help. His life was significantly affected by the case and the media coverage that followed. In 2021, a request was again submitted to the California Attorney General's office, seeking an independent review of the case. However, the office declined to intervene, citing jurisdictional and evidentiary limits. The family expressed disappointment, but vowed to keep advocating for a full criminal investigation. One important aspect of the case's legacy was its impact on forensic and investigative standards. Some experts used it as a teaching example in professional settings to discuss how to handle ambiguous death scenes and the role of civil litigation in uncovering new interpretations of existing evidence. By 2025, official records still listed Rebecca Zahau's death as a suicide. No criminal charges had ever been filed in relation to her death or Max Schachne's earlier accident. However, the family's pursuit of answers had kept the case in public awareness far longer than many expected, symbolizing the challenge of reconciling scientific, legal, and emotional truths in complex death investigations. As of 2025, the official stance of the San Diego County Sheriff's Department remains unchanged. Rebecca Zahau's death is classified as a suicide. Despite intense media coverage, civil litigation, and multiple independent reviews commissioned by the Zahau family, law enforcement has not reopened the criminal investigation. The conclusion drawn in 2011, citing the absence of evidence pointing to a homicide, still governs the official narrative. The Zahau family, however, continues to challenge that determination. Over the years, they have issued public statements reaffirming their belief that Rebecca was murdered. Mary Zahau Lohner has remained the most visible family spokesperson, often appearing in interviews and documentary features to discuss the case and the family's pursuit of justice. While they have accepted the legal limitations of further civil proceedings, their public advocacy has not waned. In the broader public, interest in the case endures. Several in-depth television specials and documentary series have aired since the civil trial, each dissecting the available evidence, legal findings, and forensic testimony. These have served not only to keep the story in public consciousness, but also to highlight broader issues about the standards of death investigations in unusual circumstances. Legal scholars have debated the implications of the case, particularly regarding the divergence between civil and criminal conclusions. The Zahau versus Schachne trial became a focal point in discussions about burden of proof, expert witness credibility, and the admissibility of forensic reconstructions in courtroom settings. Some experts view the trial as an example of how civil courts can offer a form of recourse when criminal investigations stall or fail to persuade affected families. In academic and professional forensic circles, the Zahau case is often presented as a complex scenario requiring careful multidisciplinary analysis. Questions about self-binding, behavioral indicators of suicide, and the interpretation of cryptic scene messages have all been explored in training and educational materials. The case also raises procedural questions about when and how police departments should reconsider initial conclusions when presented with contradictory expert testimony. Adam Schachne has remained out of the public eye since the settlement. He has not been subject to any criminal charges and has continued to assert his innocence, denying all allegations made during the civil proceedings. The settlement's confidentiality has limited public insight into the full terms agreed upon between both parties. For Jonah Schachne, who lost both his son and his partner within the span of 1 week in July 2011, the events cast a long and private shadow. He has largely refrained from public comment in recent years, maintaining silence out of respect for all involved, according to earlier statements. The Zahau case remains a poignant example of the difficulties families face when forensic science, legal processes, and personal grief intersect. While the official record may be closed for the Zahaw family and many members of the public, questions still linger. As of 2025, the story of Rebecca Zahaw continues to be a case studied, debated, and remembered for its complexity and lasting impact. In early February 1999, Paul Skiba prepared for a routine moving job in Colorado. At 38, Paul was the owner of Tough Movers, a Denver-based moving company. Known for his disciplined work ethic and straightforward manner, Paul took pride in his small business. That weekend, he scheduled a job in Morrison, a town nestled against the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. It was a typical operation: pack, load, and transport. Accompanying Paul on the job was Lorenzo Chivers, a 36-year-old employee. Chivers had worked with Paul on various assignments and was considered dependable. That weekend, Paul also had plans to see his daughter, 9-year-old Sarah Skiba. It was his scheduled visitation period. Despite a difficult custody arrangement, Paul was consistent about his time with Sarah. On Saturday, February 6, 1999, Paul picked up Sarah as arranged. The plan was for her to accompany him during the move and then spend the night at his home. Paul was known to involve Sarah in his routine, and she often stayed close to her father on such weekends. That morning, the trio, Paul, Lorenzo, and Sarah, set off to Morrison in one of Tough Movers' box trucks. The job proceeded through the day, with the three expected to return to Denver by evening. At around 5:30 p.m., the moving truck was reportedly seen at the job site in Morrison. There was nothing unusual about their conduct or the timeline at that point. It appeared to be another ordinary workday wrapping up. Paul's plan was to return the truck to the company lot on West 56th Avenue in Westminster and drop Lorenzo off at his residence nearby. However, as night fell, none of the three were heard from again. Family members grew concerned. Sarah's mother had expected her to return that evening. By Sunday, February 7th, when there was still no contact from Paul or Sarah, unease turned into alarm. Calls went unanswered, and no one showed up for scheduled obligations. Lorenzo Chivers also failed to contact his family, which was out of character. On Monday morning, February 8th, a Tough Movers employee found the moving truck parked at the lot. The gate was locked, as it normally would be, but something felt off. The truck had not been returned in its usual condition. The discovery would soon become central to what would unfold as one of Colorado's most perplexing missing persons cases. The Tough Movers lot on West 56th Avenue became the first concrete point in the investigation. The moving truck Paul, Sarah, and Lorenzo had taken out for the Morrison job was found parked there the morning of February 8th. Its presence, initially reassuring, soon raised more questions than it answered. Employees noted the truck had been backed into its spot differently than usual. Paul had a habit of reversing the truck into the lot facing inward. This time, it faced outward. More disturbingly, traces of blood were found in the cargo area. The lock on the rear door was missing, and the interior appeared disturbed. Scattered packing materials and a noticeable absence of tools further unsettled investigators. Surveillance footage from a nearby business was reviewed. A camera facing the street had captured grainy nighttime images showing a truck entering the lot late Saturday or early Sunday. But the footage lacked the clarity to confirm who was driving. No one was seen leaving the vehicle. Police began to piece together the trio's final known movements. After completing their moving job in Morrison late on Saturday, February 6th, Paul had intended to return the truck to the lot. Witnesses confirmed seeing Paul and Lorenzo at the job site that afternoon. A client reported nothing unusual about their behavior. Sarah had remained close to the truck throughout the job, likely reading or playing quietly. Back in Denver, Paul's home remained untouched. Sarah's belongings were still at his house, including items she would have taken back to her mother's if she had returned. Nothing had been packed or moved, indicating she had not made it back there that night. Lorenzo Shiver's car was found parked at a friend's residence where he had left it prior to heading out with Paul. His wallet and keys were missing, but his family insisted he would never leave town without contacting them. He had made plans for the following day and was excited about a potential promotion within the company. Investigators combed through Paul's phone records, noting that his last call was made around 6:30 p.m. on February 6th. It was a brief, routine check-in. There were no outgoing or incoming calls after that. Sarah's whereabouts remained similarly obscure. Her mother's efforts to reach Paul throughout Sunday had failed. When she called Tough Movers, no one answered. By Tuesday, February 9th, law enforcement had officially classified all 3 individuals as missing. The Westminster Police Department opened a full investigation. Missing persons bulletins were distributed with photos of Sarah, Paul, and Lorenzo. The disappearance of 3 people, including a child, from a small business truck during a weekend job without any witnesses, left investigators with a haunting mystery. As the hours turned into days, the Skiba, Chivers, and extended families faced a mounting sense of dread. The initial assumption that the trio had encountered a delay gave way to a deeper, more troubling realization. By midweek, February 10th, both families acknowledged that this was no ordinary disappearance. Sarah's mother, who had shared custody with Paul, became increasingly vocal in contacting authorities. She emphasized Paul's reliability when it came to Sarah, regardless of personal conflicts. He would never have simply vanished with their daughter. Her growing frustration over the lack of immediate police action pushed the case forward. Meanwhile, Lorenzo Kiver's family grew equally alarmed. He had not shown up for scheduled work, had not accessed his bank accounts, and his phone remained off. Paul's close friends and business contacts reported no indication that he had planned to go anywhere. His finances were stable, his business had ongoing contracts, and he had just renewed lease agreements. He had even scheduled upcoming jobs for the following week. There were no signs of voluntary departure. With multiple missing persons and a vehicle involved, the Westminster police escalated the case. Investigators re-examined the Tough Movers lot. They found fresh tire tracks inconsistent with Paul's driving style. They also discovered partial fingerprints inside the truck, though none provided an immediate match. The blood found in the truck, initially swabbed and tested, belonged to multiple individuals. Further analysis was required to determine whose. Flyers with photos of Sarah, Paul, and Lorenzo were posted throughout Denver and surrounding areas. Local news stations picked up the story. Reporters aired interviews with concerned family members and footage of the Tough Movers lot. The public appeal helped generate leads, though many turned up fruitless. Meanwhile, the police began canvassing Morrison and the job site. The client confirmed that the job had been completed on Saturday and noted nothing unusual. Local residents in the neighborhood were questioned, but no one recalled seeing a confrontation or anything suspicious around the time the moving job ended. Sarah's school confirmed her absence that Monday. Staff recalled her as bright and talkative. Her sudden disappearance drew concern among teachers and classmates. Authorities checked hospitals, shelters, and even outbound flight and bus records. None yielded relevant results. As a precaution, investigators issued a BOLO, be on the lookout, for Paul's other work vehicles and known associates. Interviews were conducted with former employees and acquaintances. Nothing in Paul's recent behavior suggested instability or threats. His focus remained on his business and parenting. By the end of the week, detectives officially confirmed they were investigating a possible foul play scenario. The blood in the truck, Sarah's young age, and the total lack of communication from any of the three strongly suggested that something had gone terribly wrong. The question was no longer if a crime had occurred, but when and where. As the investigation deepened, forensic teams returned to the Tough Movers lot to conduct a more thorough examination. The vehicle was towed for processing, and the surrounding property was sealed as a potential crime scene. On closer inspection, investigators identified multiple bullet holes inside the cargo area of the truck. The inner wall showed signs of gunfire at close range, with the trajectory pointing inward from the rear. In addition to blood traces, a significant discovery was made. A small piece of human scalp embedded in a crevice of the truck floor. DNA testing was expedited. The blood and tissue were determined to belong to at least two individuals, Paul and Sarah. The presence of Sarah's blood immediately altered the tone of the investigation. Authorities now classified the case as a likely homicide. An impression of a boot print made in blood was also documented inside the truck. It did not match footwear owned by Paul or Lorenzo. Investigators believed the scene inside the truck had been partially cleaned. Bleach had been used in some areas, but the cleanup was incomplete. The lack of blood spatter in key spots and the removal of certain tools pointed to a selective attempt to erase evidence. Lorenzo's DNA was not initially confirmed in the samples, but authorities did not rule out his presence. Investigators hypothesized that any cleaning of the scene could have obscured or removed traces that might have belonged to him. The timeline suggested that whatever had occurred happened shortly after the truck returned from the Morrison job. Police theorized that the three had made it back to the Tough Movers lot on Saturday night, February 6th. The fact that the truck was returned, locked, and parked in an unusual manner suggested an effort to stage a normal return. However, no surveillance cameras at the lot directly captured the faces of those inside the truck. Detectives also found that the keys to the truck were missing. Paul had always retained them on his person or in a designated place in the office. His wallet and personal items were also gone. His office space showed no signs of forced entry, but a few items were missing from the storage area, primarily packing tools and tape. These items, while not unusual to be out during a job, had not been returned. The absence of Lorenzo's belongings, including his identification and phone, fueled concern. There was no record of his phone being turned on since the day of the move. Friends noted that he never left without his ID, especially when working a job involving company vehicles. Outside the immediate area, a nearby industrial unit reported a loud bang the night of February 6th, but dismissed it as routine noise in the area. Police canvassed more businesses nearby, but no security footage captured anything beyond shadowy movements. As days passed without a break, the families were officially notified of the case's reclassification. They were told it was no longer a search, but an investigation into a triple homicide. Grief and disbelief settled in. With no bodies recovered and only blood and damaged property to suggest what had occurred, the case remained suspended in limbo, tragic, violent, and unanswered. With the case now under the Homicide Division's jurisdiction, the Westminster Police Department intensified its efforts. Detectives partnered with forensic specialists, and federal authorities were consulted. The core focus became reconstructing the exact timeline between the end of the Morrison job and the return of the truck to the Tough Movers lot. Phone records, traffic surveillance, and witness accounts were re-examined. While Paul's last call had been placed around 6:30 p.m. on February 6th, no further electronic activity followed. Sarah's and Lorenzo's phones were also inactive after that window. Investigators tried to triangulate possible locations based on cell tower data, but the results were inconclusive. The stretch between Morrison and Denver offered multiple remote routes, few of them covered by surveillance. The condition of the truck indicated that the crime likely occurred after returning to the lot or shortly before arrival. The blood evidence, combined with the confined location of the wounds, suggested that the victims may have been ambushed inside the truck itself. Ballistics analysis confirmed that the bullets had been fired from a small caliber handgun. However, no weapon was found at the scene. A lead emerged when forensic teams isolated partial DNA from a third unknown male. The sample did not match Paul, Lorenzo, or Sarah. Although it wasn't sufficient for a full profile, it was stored in CODIS for future comparison. This suggested the possible involvement of a third party. Investigators considered several possibilities. A disgruntled former employee, a personal acquaintance of Paul's, or someone unknown who had knowledge of the lot's layout and routines. Paul's personal life came under scrutiny. He had been involved in a contentious custody battle with Sarah's mother. Investigators interviewed both parties, reviewed court documents, and checked alibis. While tensions were noted, no actionable evidence pointed to her or her associates. Friends described Paul as cautious and private, but not fearful or paranoid. Lorenzo's background showed no criminal record, but detectives explored whether he had any unresolved disputes or connections that might be relevant. Interviews with his acquaintances yielded nothing to indicate he was targeted. He was viewed as a loyal employee with no known enemies. The moving company itself was not considered high risk. Tough Movers had no history of theft, violent incidents, or lawsuits. However, one former employee described a recent argument between Paul and an unnamed man over payment and job quality. Police attempted to locate the individual, but found no link beyond the reported disagreement. Despite the grim findings, the absence of bodies limited the case's classification. Legally, the victims remained missing, even as the evidence pointed overwhelmingly to murder. Police issued statements appealing for public tips and offered a reward. Flyers were updated to reflect the change in the case status and distributed again across the state. Media outlets began referring to it as a disappearance with foul play, and the pressure on authorities increased. Families demanded transparency and pleaded for answers. Detectives continued to investigate leads, but progress slowed as weeks turned into months. No credible eyewitnesses, no murder weapon, no definitive location of the killings, only silence and a growing list of unanswered questions. As investigators exhausted forensic avenues, the focus shifted to motives and potential suspects. While physical evidence had been partially gathered from the truck, the broader context of Paul Skiba's relationships and professional environment became a central component of the inquiry. Detectives compiled a list of people in Paul's orbit, former employees, clients, and personal acquaintances, looking for patterns of conflict, jealousy, or financial tension. One avenue explored was Paul's business dealings. Tough Movers, though modest, had steady clientele. Paul was known to manage his operations tightly, preferring to handle contracts himself. In interviews, some former workers described him as firm but fair. However, a few recalled heated exchanges over scheduling and wages. At least one ex-employee had left on poor terms, accusing Paul of shorting hours. That individual, when located and questioned, denied involvement and had a verified alibi for the night of February 6th. Police revisited the theory that someone familiar with the lot's layout and procedures had ambushed the trio. The absence of forced entry and the truck's return pointed to someone who knew how the company operated. Additionally, the truck had been parked neatly, suggesting the killer or killers had experience driving such vehicles. This detail narrowed the suspect pool to those with previous moving experience or access to similar trucks. Another angle of interest was Paul's romantic life. Friends noted that Paul had ended a relationship months earlier. Though not widely discussed, the breakup had reportedly involved tension and mistrust. The woman in question was cooperative during questioning and presented records showing she had been out of state that weekend. Investigators found no connection between her and the other missing individuals. Lorenzo Shivers' background showed no overt warning signs, but detectives explored whether he could have been targeted independently. No known threats had been made against him, and his bank accounts showed no unusual activity. His family stressed that he was dedicated to the job and was looking forward to an upcoming bonus. Investigators also weighed the theory of a robbery gone wrong. However, no money was reported missing, and Paul's known valuables, including a watch and tools, were not found at the scene or on the truck. The randomness of such a robbery seemed unlikely given the location. An enclosed private lot with no signage indicating valuables were stored inside. Some speculated whether Paul himself had staged the disappearance, but the forensic evidence contradicted this. The blood and scalp fragment belonging to Sarah, in particular, pointed to her being a victim. Moreover, there was no evidence of Paul having withdrawn funds or made travel preparations. His financial records remained untouched. The case began to attract the attention of private investigators, some hired by the families, others offering pro bono assistance. They re-examined timelines, made public appeals, and even tested new forensic software on old evidence. While no breakthroughs occurred, the case remained active in media circles, keeping pressure on law enforcement. Ultimately, despite pursuing dozens of leads, the central mystery endured. Who would target 3 individuals with no known enemies, kill them silently, and leave behind only partial traces? The lack of an obvious motive or suspect left detectives navigating a fog of speculation. Every theory carried weight, and none brought answers. As weeks passed without a resolution, the disappearance of Sarah Skiba, Paul Skiba, and Lorenzo Shivers captured public attention. Local news outlets began covering the case regularly, emphasizing its disturbing details. A father, his child, and an employee all vanished without a trace. Blood found in a return truck, and no witnesses. The story quickly spread beyond Colorado. National media outlets picked it up, intrigued by the eerie combination of familial and workplace ties, and the complete absence of recovered bodies. Interviews with family members aired on nightly news broadcasts. Sarah's mother made emotional appeals for information, while Paul's relatives emphasized his devotion to his daughter and business. Lorenzo's family, too, urged the public to come forward with tips. In March 1999, the case was featured on America's Most Wanted. The segment presented a reenactment of the trio's last known movements and detailed the discoveries in the moving truck. Viewers were encouraged to report any relevant information, even anonymously. The exposure led to a spike in tips, though most were dead ends. The Skiba case also appeared on the Montel Williams Show, which ran a feature focused on Sarah as a missing child. The segment included photos of her and interviews with her grieving family. Her age and vulnerability struck a chord with viewers. Volunteers began organizing flyer distributions, awareness events, and candlelight vigils. Her name became part of larger missing children advocacy campaigns. Web forums and early internet message boards picked up on the case. Amateur sleuths analyzed publicly released evidence, speculated about motives, and discussed theories. Some focused on the strange positioning of the truck. Others zeroed in on possible suspects or patterns in Paul's business practices. Though these discussions yielded no new official evidence, they kept public interest alive. Law enforcement was cautious about releasing further details. Investigators feared compromising the integrity of their leads or giving false hope. However, they acknowledged the value of media coverage in sustaining pressure and engagement. The more visible the case, the greater the chance someone might come forward with crucial information. In Colorado, the case became a point of public anxiety. Parents discussed it in schools, and it was cited in local debates about improving safety measures for small businesses. Community watch groups formed in the neighborhoods where the trio had last been seen. The media spotlight did more than just tell a story. It reshaped how people thought about safety, trust, and justice. Despite the attention, frustration mounted as the months wore on with no arrests, no confessions, and no new physical evidence. The Skiba, Chivers, and extended families expressed gratitude for the coverage, but voiced deep anguish that visibility had not yet brought resolution. As the anniversary of the disappearance approached, major networks revisited the case. With each broadcast, they renewed calls for information and kept the images of Paul, Sarah, and Lorenzo in the public eye. Yet behind the headlines and camera crews, the central facts remained unchanged. 3 people were gone, and no one could yet say how or why. Following the intense media coverage, law enforcement expanded their search beyond the Tough Movers lot and the Morrison job site. Areas along the route between the 2 locations were analyzed with aerial surveillance, canine units, and coordinated ground searches. Police, aided by volunteers and private investigators, examined nearby fields, ditches, and isolated industrial zones. One of the most targeted areas was Soda Lakes, a recreational site near Morrison with dense vegetation and difficult terrain. It was identified as a potential disposal site due to its proximity and seclusion. Divers conducted multiple sweeps while sonar equipment scanned the lake beds. Despite weeks of effort, no evidence connected to the missing trio was found. Canine teams were brought in to search both the Tough Movers lot and the surrounding industrial area. Cadaver dogs indicated possible scents near a drainage canal behind the lot, but no remains were recovered. Excavations and soil analysis failed to yield results. It remained unclear whether the location was genuinely connected to the crime or a misleading trace. The absence of bodies posed a severe limitation. Without them, investigators were unable to confirm the exact cause or time of death. Moreover, there were no indications of where the crime might have concluded, whether at the lot, en route, or somewhere else entirely. This lack of closure complicated the legal classification and limited prosecutorial options. Police distributed updated missing persons flyers across neighboring states. Truck stops, gas stations, and interstate motels received copies. The possibility that the bodies had been transported across state lines was considered, especially given the access to a large moving truck. However, no credible sightings or related incidents were reported. Seasonal weather further complicated efforts. Snow and freezing conditions delayed certain searches and compromised preservation of outdoor evidence. Once spring arrived, follow-up sweeps were organized, focusing again on isolated rural sites and unused industrial properties. These renewed efforts also came up empty. Families continued their own parallel efforts. The Chivers family hired a private investigator who conducted interviews with individuals previously dismissed as low risk by police. Meanwhile, Sarah's family pushed for more comprehensive searches and lobbied for legislative support to expand resources for missing children cases. Theories persisted that the perpetrators had assistance in concealing evidence. The deliberate return of the truck, its cleaned interior, and the selective removal of items all suggested planning. Yet, without hard leads, investigators were left with educated speculation and circumstantial inferences. In late 1999, a community-led search group combed the woods west of Denver, using GPS mapping and heat sensors. Although bones were discovered during one expedition, they were determined to be from wildlife. Still, the persistence of volunteers kept the investigation in public consciousness. Despite exhaustive efforts, no physical trace of the victims beyond what was initially discovered in the truck had been found by year's end. The disappearance of Paul, Sarah, and Lorenzo remained unsolved, not due to lack of effort, but because the clues left behind were few, fragmented, and deliberately obscured. In early 2025, the Westminster Police Department announced significant developments in the long-standing investigation into the 1999 disappearance of Paul Skiba, his daughter Sarah, and employee Lorenzo Shivers. Detectives revealed that parts of the moving truck used during the incident, including a two-piece ramp, moving blankets, and straps, were missing. These items had not been accounted for in previous searches and were considered potentially critical to understanding the events of that day. Advancements in forensic technology allowed investigators to reanalyze existing evidence. New DNA samples were identified and are currently undergoing testing. This re-examination has provided fresh leads, prompting authorities to re-interview individuals connected to the case. Detectives expressed optimism that these developments could bring them closer to resolving the case. The families of the victims have been informed of these new findings. Sarah's mother, Michelle Russell, expressed hope that the renewed efforts would finally provide answers about her daughter's fate. The Westminster Police Department continues to seek information from the public, emphasizing the importance of community assistance in bringing closure to this case. The air was thick with festivity on July 22, 1978, as the city of Pocatello, Idaho, came together to celebrate Pioneer Day, a significant event in many communities with roots in Mormon history. That Saturday afternoon, families crowded the parks, children played in open fields, and music drifted from makeshift stages. Among the attendees were two young girls, 12-year-old Tina Anderson and 15-year-old Patricia Patsy Campbell. Tina Anderson was described as shy and soft-spoken, with a thoughtful nature that endeared her to family and friends. Her younger age often made her more reserved in public, but she enjoyed being part of a group, especially when with older girls like Patsy. Patsy, in contrast, had a more outgoing demeanor. At 15, she was growing into a confident teenager, someone who enjoyed social gatherings and being seen as responsible among her peers. The girls lived in the same neighborhood in Pocatello's west side and had become close in the months leading up to the summer. That day, they were together at a park on the west side of the city near the Bannock County Fairgrounds. They had told their families they were going to the fair and possibly walking to a nearby store afterward. It was not unusual for kids in that neighborhood to roam freely during daylight, especially during community events where large numbers of people created an illusion of safety. As the afternoon rolled into evening, Tina and Patsy were seen by several friends and acquaintances. Witnesses later reported seeing them walking along the west side streets and heading in the direction of the neighborhood convenience store. It was the last time anyone would see them alive. By the early evening, when Tina and Patsy had not returned home, their families began to worry. Calls were made, and a small search began among neighbors. At first, it was hoped they had stayed too long with friends or had gone to another part of the fair without telling anyone. But by nightfall, that optimism began to fade. The girl's absence was reported to the police, and within hours, a more organized search was underway. Officers canvassed the area, retraced the route from the park to the store, and questioned festival goers who may have seen them. But there were no signs of struggle, no personal belongings left behind, and no credible witnesses who could place them after the walk away from the park. Pocatello, with its close-knit community, was shaken. The idea that two young girls could vanish in broad daylight during a major event defied understanding. Over the next days, volunteers joined law enforcement in a massive search effort. Helicopters scanned the surrounding foothills, and bloodhounds were brought in to trace scents. Despite their efforts, no new clues emerged. Rumors spread quickly. Some suggested the girls may have run away, though their families vehemently rejected that idea. Neither girl had taken belongings or money, and both were described as having no reason to flee. Others whispered darker theories: abduction, trafficking, or foul play at the hands of someone local. By the end of July, the immediate search had slowed. Flyers bearing the girls' faces were posted in windows and on telephone poles. The Pioneer Day celebration had turned into a source of pain, a grim reminder of what had been lost. Still, hope lingered that the girls might be found alive. As summer turned to fall, families clung to memories. Tina's mother recalled her daughter's last words before heading out. Simple and ordinary, never thinking they might be the final conversation. Patsy's siblings scoured the neighborhood for weeks, retracing routes, asking questions, and hoping for anything that might lead to a break. But silence followed, and in that silence, a mystery began to settle over Pocatello, one that would haunt the city for decades. In the hours following Tina Anderson and Patricia Campbell's disappearance, the city of Pocatello transformed from a community in celebration to one in shock. Word spread quickly among residents. Two girls had vanished during a crowded public event in broad daylight. As concern grew, authorities intensified their efforts. They began with the last known location, the park where Pioneer Day festivities had taken place, and worked outward. Investigators first spoke to friends and family members. Both girls had strong ties to the area and no history of running away. Tina had recently completed 6th grade, and her school records and teachers described her as dependable and cautious. Patsy had just finished her freshman year in high school. She had a more independent streak, but nothing in her recent behavior suggested she was planning to leave home. Witness statements were vague. Some festival attendees recalled seeing the girls walking westward, possibly toward the convenience store on North Arthur Avenue. Others thought they might have entered a car, though details of that sighting conflicted. No license plate was reported, and no one could agree on the make or color of the vehicle. Police followed each report, but with no physical evidence, no dropped items, no clear point of departure. The trail quickly cooled. Search teams were organized to comb nearby areas. They scoured alleys, drainage ditches, and the wooded outskirts of the city. Door-to-door inquiries were made, and missing persons bulletins were distributed to police departments across Idaho and neighboring states. Officers checked bus depots, highways, and even airports, hoping the girls hadn't been taken far. By the end of the first week, the absence of tangible evidence was alarming. The FBI was consulted but did not formally join the case, citing a lack of federal jurisdiction. Local officers, though diligent, were stretched thin and faced the growing frustration of a community demanding answers. Tips continued to come in, but many were based on speculation or were quickly disproven. The families remained active and visible. Both mothers appeared in local media, pleading for their daughter's safe return. They spoke of birthdays missed and personal belongings left untouched. Tina's bed remained neatly made, her favorite stuffed animal still resting on the pillow. Patsy's radio, which she never left home without, sat on her dresser, silent. Community response was heartfelt. Churches organized vigils, neighbors left porch lights on at night, and local businesses donated flyers and printing services to keep the search effort visible. Volunteers posted missing posters across Pocatello and mailed them to cities as far away as Boise and Salt Lake City. School children wrote letters to the missing girls, expressing hope that they would return. Despite the outpouring of support, frustration began to set in. Rumors multiplied, including claims of cult activity or strangers spotted in the area days before the disappearance. Police dismissed most of these as unfounded. Still, they followed every lead, no matter how unlikely. In one case, investigators traveled to Utah to interview a man who claimed he had seen the girls hitchhiking along I-15. The lead proved false. The absence of credible suspects only deepened the mystery. Authorities questioned local sex offenders and individuals with past abduction allegations, but no connections were found. Theories included the possibility of the girls being lured away by someone they knew or abducted by a stranger posing as a trustworthy figure. Both scenarios were chilling and difficult to prove without witnesses. Weeks turned into months. By October, the official search had scaled back, though the investigation remained open. The missing persons bulletins were entered into the National Crime Information Center database. Still, no match ever surfaced. As fall gave way to winter, the hope of finding the girls alive began to wane. For the families, holidays became unbearable. Birthdays passed in silence. Each phone call or knock at the door brought a flicker of hope that quickly dimmed. For Tina and Patsy's parents, the hardest part wasn't just the loss. It was the not knowing. The investigation continued quietly in the background, handled by a small rotation of detectives. Every few weeks, new information would emerge, a reported sighting, a cryptic phone call. But each time, the outcome was the same. Nothing solid, no trace, just silence. In Pocatello, the Pioneer Day celebrations were more subdued the following year. There were no parades in the same park, and many families chose to stay home. Tina and Patsy had vanished without a trace, and the town had no explanation. The case, already cold, was slipping into a file cabinet of unresolved pain. By early 1979, the disappearance of Tina Anderson and Patricia Campbell had become one of the most confounding cases in southeastern Idaho. Despite an expansive early effort and a flood of community support, law enforcement faced the hard truth that no meaningful progress had been made. The investigation, once the subject of daily media updates, gradually receded from headlines. Detectives assigned to the case remained determined, but were constrained by limited resources. The Bannock County Sheriff's Office and the Pocatello Police Department divided responsibilities and worked leads as they came. But, with each passing week, the trail grew colder. Interagency cooperation was crucial but imperfect, compounded by jurisdictional limits and the era's lack of advanced technology. They revisited early tips, re-interviewed witnesses, and examined local criminal records. Officers created a timeline of the girls' final known movements and overlaid it with known offenders and transient visitors in the area at the time. A few names repeatedly surfaced, but there was never enough evidence to pursue charges or detain suspects. Many leads were murky, based on partial recollections, misidentified individuals, or rumors amplified by fear. The case was further complicated by the wide range of possible motives, Theories abounded: a crime of opportunity, an act of violence by someone known to the girls, or an abduction by a passing stranger. Each presented a different investigative challenge. Some speculated about a connection to other unsolved cases in the region, though no pattern emerged. Detectives pored over missing persons cases and unsolved murders across state lines, looking for common threads. Despite the lack of results, the girls' families never gave up. Patsy's relatives compiled binders of news clippings and notes, conducting their own research parallel to law enforcement. Tina's mother contacted private investigators, though cost made sustained support impossible. Both families took part in national missing children's networks and followed up on even the most tenuous claims. The months stretched into years. Public interest faded as newer tragedies captured attention. But the case was never officially closed. In 1980, a new detective was assigned to the file and initiated a limited reinvestigation. He visited the site of the girls' last known whereabouts, reviewed old interviews, and sought out people who had moved away. Still, the outcome remained unchanged. No suspects, no evidence, no trace. Then, subtle shifts occurred. Advances in forensic techniques were beginning to take hold, including more reliable methods for preserving and analyzing physical evidence. Though there were no belongings left behind by Tina or Patsy, the hope was that in time, new tools might reanimate the stalled investigation. Community memory lingered. Some residents continued to revisit the site of the celebration, leaving flowers or notes each July. The case had etched itself into the town's collective consciousness, a reminder of vulnerability, of how quickly security could dissolve. A few individuals came forward over the years with what they believed were critical details. A man claimed to have seen the girls speaking to someone in a red truck. Another said he heard screams near the fairgrounds that night. Each time, the information was followed up, but each time it reached a dead end. The case began to take on the shape of a local legend, spoken of in hushed tones, especially among those who had been children at the time. Teachers warned students about walking alone. Parents drove their children even short distances. The anxiety created by the unsolved case outlived the initial urgency of the investigation. By 1981, the files had grown thick with reports, maps, interview transcripts, and photos, an archive of loss and uncertainty. Investigators preserved what they could, hoping that time might yield new answers. Still, the families were left with the same unanswered question. What had happened to Tina and Patsy after they left the park that summer day? For now, the answer remained buried, hidden somewhere between official reports and collective memory. It was not forgotten, but it was unresolved. In the spring of 1981, nearly 3 years after Tina Anderson and Patricia Campbell vanished, an unmarked grave was uncovered in Oneida County, Idaho, about 60 miles south of Pocatello. It was a rugged, remote area, far from main roads and rarely visited. The discovery was made by a local hunter navigating the sparsely forested terrain. He noticed bones protruding from shallow soil and alerted authorities immediately. Deputies from the Oneida County Sheriff's Office responded and quickly realized they had found human remains. The site was carefully cordoned off. Excavation revealed 2 sets of skeletal remains buried together, side by side. Initial examination confirmed they belonged to adolescent females. Forensic specialists were brought in from Boise to assist with identification. Clothing remnants were recovered, tattered, weather-worn fabric, consistent with what Tina and Patsy were last seen wearing. Jewelry found near the bodies matched descriptions provided by their families. A preliminary dental comparison provided a strong indication of identity. Within weeks, confirmation came. The remains belonged to Tina Anderson and Patricia Campbell. The news devastated the families. For nearly 3 years, they had endured the pain of not knowing. Now they faced the certainty of death. Though grief-stricken, they were no longer held hostage by ambiguity. Memorial services were held in Pocatello, drawing large crowds who came to mourn, support the families, and reflect on the community's shared trauma. Law enforcement now had a crime scene, albeit a degraded one. The remains had been exposed to the elements for years. Scavenging animals, seasonal weather, and soil erosion had altered the burial site. Despite these challenges, the scene yielded important clues. Both girls had been buried without care or ceremony, a detail that suggested urgency and a desire to conceal. Forensic examination found signs of trauma. While decomposition limited the extent of conclusions, there were indications that one or both had suffered blunt force injuries. No evidence of gunshot wounds was found. Toxicology was impossible due to the time elapsed. Still, the investigators believed the girls had likely died shortly after their disappearance. The location itself raised questions. The burial site was secluded, accessible only by unmarked dirt tracks. Investigators believed the perpetrator had to be familiar with the area, someone local, or someone who spent time hunting or camping in that region. Maps were studied and property records reviewed. Officers interviewed residents within a 20-mile radius of the site. Most had no recollection of suspicious activity from the summer of 1978, but the area's isolation meant few people traveled there at all. The discovery renewed public interest in the case. Tips surged again. Some were hopeful, others misinformed. A man came forward claiming he had seen a pickup truck near that area in July 1978 with 2 girls in the passenger seat. Another woman recalled hearing screams during a camping trip years earlier. None of these led to solid leads. In the weeks following the discovery, investigators cross-referenced known offenders with any connection to the burial site. They interviewed parolees, former residents, and even out-of-state truck drivers known to travel through southern Idaho. They also sought assistance from other law enforcement agencies in Utah and Nevada, considering the possibility of an out-of-state perpetrator. Still, progress was slow. While the burial site gave context, it offered no direct forensic evidence pointing to a suspect. DNA testing was in its infancy and unavailable for degraded samples. There were no tire tracks, tools, or personal items left behind. No fingerprints, only the bones, clothing, and the grim finality of the grave. The families of Tina and Patsy continued to advocate for answers. They pushed for updates, met with detectives regularly, and stayed in the public eye. They refused to let the case slip back into silence. Memorials were placed near the site where the bodies were found, and anniversaries were marked with renewed appeals for information. The community of Pocatello felt the loss acutely. The discovery, though expected by some, confirmed a tragic ending many had hoped to avoid. Schools held assemblies on safety and remembrance. Churches dedicated sermons. For the first time in 3 years, the girls were brought home, but not in the way anyone had prayed for. Despite new momentum, the investigation would again enter a difficult phase. Leads thinned and public attention slowly waned. But for detectives and the families, the discovery in Oneida County marked a turning point. The case was no longer one of disappearance. It was a double homicide. And somewhere in Idaho, the person who had buried them remained unknown. With the discovery of the girls' remains in 1981, investigators reclassified the case from missing persons to homicide. Though it added clarity to the scope of the crime, the shift presented new difficulties. Detectives now had a confirmed location of interest and a more focused timeline. But nearly 3 years had passed since the crime occurred. The trail had gone cold, and key forensic opportunities had long since vanished. Still, the Oneida County Sheriff's Office and the Pocatello Police Department recommitted resources to the case. A new task force was briefly assembled to re-interview all original witnesses and examine whether the location of the graves provided any links to known suspects. Investigators reviewed archived reports and reanalyzed notes taken in 1978. They focused especially on unsubstantiated sightings of a pickup truck near the area that summer, but no firm conclusions could be drawn. The nature of the burial, remote, rushed, shallow, remained a focal point. It suggested the killer had acted quickly after the abduction, possibly within hours. Detectives hypothesized the perpetrator had either lived nearby or had planned the location in advance. Still, the theory produced no definitive list of suspects. When officers canvassed the region around the burial site, residents remembered little of that time. Some properties had changed hands multiple times since 1978, making follow-ups difficult. With the forensic tools of the 1980s still limited, physical evidence offered little hope. Investigators retained clothing fibers and other trace materials in the hope of future analysis. A few items were sent to state labs for more refined testing, but results were inconclusive. Blood evidence, if it had ever existed, was long gone. Detectives pursued a small number of persons of interest. One man, a former Pocatello resident with a history of violent behavior, had been questioned in an unrelated case years earlier. His name appeared again when investigators cross-referenced known criminal records with individuals who had access to the Oneida wilderness. However, there was no physical evidence connecting him to the murders, and he denied any involvement. Another suspect, a traveling laborer, had been in southern Idaho during the summer of 1978. He left the state shortly after the girls disappeared, but police were unable to verify his movements or link him to the burial site. Without stronger proof, the investigation could not proceed further. By the late 1980s, the case had become a cold file. Still, it was never closed. New detectives inherited the case every few years. They reviewed the same documents, reread the same witness statements, and followed up on occasional tips that trickled in. Each time, they hit the same wall. No new evidence, no witnesses, and no confessions. Then, in the early 2000s, advances in DNA testing offered a new chance. Law enforcement agencies across the country began re-evaluating cold cases using techniques unavailable in earlier decades. The Bannock County Sheriff's Office submitted preserved items from the burial site for modern DNA analysis. Unfortunately, the results yielded no usable profiles. The condition of the evidence, coupled with its exposure to natural elements, had compromised the biological material. Despite the setback, the renewed forensic effort reignited interest. A small cold case unit revisited key interviews. They looked again at the red pickup truck sighting from 1978. They also investigated potential serial offenders with ties to the western U.S. A few promising leads emerged, including individuals incarcerated in other states who matched general timelines or behavioral patterns. Yet, each suspect, once thoroughly reviewed, was cleared or lacked any connection to the Idaho case. Families remained involved throughout the renewed efforts. Both the Anderson and Campbell families cooperated fully with investigators and continued to push for justice. Over the years, they participated in media interviews, appeared on local television, and collaborated with victim advocacy organizations. Their commitment kept the story in circulation and occasionally drew in new information. In 2008, the case received another brief resurgence of attention, following a statewide push to re-examine unsolved murders. Tina and Patsy's file was included in a list distributed to law enforcement agencies across the Northwest. Some investigators speculated about possible links to long-haul truck drivers or transient criminals operating along the I-15 corridor. Though plausible, the theory remained speculative. No names emerged that could be tied definitively to the burial site or the girls' final movements. Despite the enduring silence, the families remained hopeful that justice could still be achieved. With each decade, the case became both colder and more precious, a puzzle whose missing pieces had resisted every effort to complete it. Yet the files remained open, the memories preserved, and the hope alive. The identity of the killer remained hidden, but the determination to find them never faded. As the years wore on, the unsolved murders of Tina Anderson and Patricia Campbell continued to cast a long shadow over southeastern Idaho. Each new detective assigned to the case faced a complex file stretching back decades, filled with handwritten reports, grainy photographs, and yellowing maps. The trail remained cold, yet the case stayed active, a symbol of the community's enduring resolve. The families, despite the passage of time, remained deeply engaged. Tina's mother maintained a binder of every article, letter, and note related to her daughter's disappearance and murder. Patsy's siblings worked to ensure their sister's name stayed in the public eye, often participating in local events or speaking with reporters who showed interest. Their persistence was fueled not only by grief, but also by a deep need for accountability. By the 2010 a new generation of investigators joined the effort. These younger detectives brought fresh energy and a more data-driven approach. With improved access to national databases and evolving DNA techniques, they hope to extract new information from old evidence. Items preserved from the burial site, fabric, hair, and soil samples, were re-examined. Unfortunately, degradation over decades continued to limit their usefulness. Still, technology offered new pathways. Investigators uploaded any viable genetic material into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. No matches came back. They also explored the possibility of using emerging genetic genealogy tools, which had proven successful in identifying suspects in other cold cases. Yet due to the quality of the remaining DNA, the profiles were insufficient for genealogical tracing. Efforts continued on other fronts. Detectives revisited individuals previously labeled as persons of interest. Some were re-interviewed. A few had since passed away, while others had moved out of state. One man, previously ruled out in the 1980s, was questioned again after inconsistencies were found in his original statement. Ultimately, there was no new evidence to implicate him. Parallel to the investigative efforts, media interest occasionally revived public awareness. Local news stations marked anniversaries of the disappearance. Documentaries about unsolved crimes in Idaho included brief segments on the girls' case. In one such program, a retired detective spoke candidly about the frustration he felt, knowing the burial site had yielded so few clues, despite being the most tangible lead they ever had. Community support remained strong. The annual Pioneer Day celebrations became opportunities for remembrance. Volunteers often set up small booths distributing information about the case and encouraging anyone with knowledge to come forward. A local artist painted a mural near the site where the girls had last been seen, turning a painful history into a tribute. The girls were also remembered in broader efforts. In 2016, the Idaho Cold Cases Task Force was formed, and Tina and Patsy's file was among the first reviewed. A panel of retired and current investigators met regularly to assess the likelihood of new developments. They explored whether the case could be linked to known serial offenders, but no matches fit the location, timeline, and method of concealment. Social media added another dimension. Amateur sleuths, true crime forums, and dedicated pages began discussing the case, speculating about suspects, and attempting to crowdsource new information. While some theories veered into the implausible, a few tips were passed along to authorities. Investigators were careful to verify every claim, but most proved to be dead ends. Throughout all of this, the families kept the girls' memories alive. Tina and Patsy became more than just victims. They were symbols of a town's resilience. Their names remained part of public discussions about safety, justice, and the long road of grief that accompanies unresolved tragedy. Though decades had passed, detectives never ruled out the possibility of a resolution. They maintained a dedicated file and preserved physical evidence with the hope that science would one day catch up to the questions that remained. They knew that time alone wouldn't solve the case, but persistence might. In the end, the search for justice was less about closure and more about acknowledgement, about bearing witness, about remembering that two young girls had left a park one summer day and never returned, not by choice, but by the hand of someone who had yet to be found. As of the 2020 S, the case of Tina Anderson and Patricia Campbell remains one of Idaho's most haunting unsolved homicides. The details have been preserved in files stored across multiple departments, backed by digital copies and revisited periodically by investigators who refuse to let the memory of the two girls fade entirely. The location of their disappearance, the rough trail to the Oneida County burial site, and the lack of forensic evidence still leave more questions than answers. In July 2020, on the 42nd anniversary of their disappearance, law enforcement and local media revisited the case publicly. The renewed attention included interviews with surviving family members and retired officers who had once worked the investigation. Their reflections painted a somber portrait of what had been lost, not just two young lives, but also a sense of safety that once defined Pocatello. The current status of the investigation is open but inactive. This means that while the case is not actively worked on a daily basis, it remains unresolved, and any credible new lead would prompt immediate attention. Detectives continue to monitor any reports or technological breakthroughs that could affect evidence gathered decades ago. Items from the burial site remain in evidence storage, preserved with care, in the hope that future advances may render them more informative. Over time, several working theories have been developed, but none confirmed. Some investigators believe the abduction was opportunistic, carried out by someone passing through the area, possibly a long-haul trucker or transient laborer. Others argue it was likely someone local, familiar with both the park where the girls were last seen and the remote site where they were found. Despite exhaustive background checks and interviews, no suspect has been conclusively linked to both locations. Forensic technology remains the most likely path to a breakthrough. Though initial DNA testing failed to yield profiles, hope lies in emerging methods for reconstructing genetic material from degraded samples. Mitochondrial DNA and whole genome sequencing have provided insights in other cases from the same era. If even a partial profile can be extracted, it could open the door to genetic genealogy, a method used successfully in numerous cold cases across the country. The girls' case also helped shape broader institutional changes. It highlighted gaps in communication between agencies, limitations in early forensic science, and the need for long-term case management strategies. In Idaho, it contributed to a push for statewide coordination on missing and exploited children, and later, support for cold case units. Memorials continue. Tina and Patsy are remembered not only by their families, but by the city that still marks their loss. In 2022, a community gathering near the site of the original park event honored their memory with a candlelight vigil. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers attended, some sharing memories, others simply offering presents in recognition of a shared grief. Digital archives, maintained by local libraries and historical societies, ensure that their story is preserved for future generations. Newspaper clippings, public records, and photos have been scanned and made available online, so that Tina and Patsy's lives, brief though they were, are never forgotten. They've become a part of the region's history, not just as victims, but as two young girls who once ran through a summer park and vanished into silence. To this day, anyone with information is encouraged to contact local law enforcement. Every few years, small campaigns are launched to renew public attention. Billboards, social media posts, and interviews with cold case detectives. Each appeal carries the same message. Someone, somewhere, knows the truth. As of now, no one had been arrested or charged. No confession has emerged. The final moments of July 22, 1978 remain cloaked in uncertainty, but the determination to solve the case has not diminished. Investigators continue to believe that even after decades, a single tip, an overlooked piece of information, could unravel the mystery. Until then, the story remains open-ended, a quiet file in a drawer, 2 names spoken every July, and a community still waiting for justice. The morning of June 27, 2000 began like many others in the quiet town of Warren, Massachusetts. Molly Bish, a 16-year-old lifeguard, prepared for another day of work at Commons Pond. She had started the seasonal job only a week earlier and was still getting used to the routine. Her mother, Maggie Bish, drove her to the pond that morning, as she had done each day since Molly began working there. The Bish family lived in a peaceful residential neighborhood. Molly, the youngest of 3 children, was known for her athleticism and involvement in school activities. That summer morning, she donned her red lifeguard swimsuit and grabbed her lunch towel and rescue gear. At approximately 10 a.m., Maggie dropped her off at the parking lot near the lifeguard station. Maggie noticed a suspicious man sitting in a white car when she arrived at the pond. The man, described as being in his 50s, wore a mustache and seemed out of place. He caught her attention, but not enough to raise alarm. After dropping Molly off, Maggie drove away, believing her daughter was safely at her post. Later that morning, a local woman arrived at Commons Pond with her children. When she reached the pond's beach area, she found it unguarded. Molly's belongings were there, her backpack, sandals, and towel neatly placed. But there was no sign of Molly herself. Concerned, the woman reported the situation to local authorities. Initial assumptions suggested that Molly may have wandered off or gone for a swim. However, as time passed and there was still no sign of her, concern turned to alarm. The Bish family was notified, and a search began. Law enforcement arrived quickly and began combing the area. Helicopters, divers, and K-9 units were deployed. Volunteers from the community joined the effort, forming search parties that covered nearby woods, roads, and waterways. For days, the search continued without any significant leads. The disappearance of Molly Bish marked the beginning of the largest and most expensive missing person search in Massachusetts history at the time. Despite the scale of the operation and the public attention it received, no immediate clues emerged. The initial shock of her vanishing would soon evolve into a prolonged and painful chapter for her family and the community of Warren. In the days that followed Molly Bish's disappearance, Warren transformed from a quiet town into the center of a massive search operation. Authorities from local, state, and federal agencies joined the effort. The Massachusetts State Police coordinated with the FBI, while hundreds of volunteers, friends, and strangers canvassed the area around Coleman's Pond and beyond. Search teams worked tirelessly, often through intense summer heat. Helicopters scanned dense woodland from above, while divers explored the pond's murky depths. Tracking dogs followed potential scent trails, though none led to definitive results. Volunteers handed out flyers, posted notices, and conducted door-to-door inquiries in the hope of uncovering a clue. From the beginning, the circumstances of Molly's disappearance raised troubling questions. Her lifeguard station showed no signs of struggle. Her belongings remained undisturbed. The beach had yet to open for the day, and there were no confirmed witnesses to her movements after her mother dropped her off. Investigators initially considered the possibility of an accident, but quickly shifted focus to foul play. Tips poured in. Witnesses reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles near Commons Pond in the days before Molly vanished. One account described a white car and a man matching the description Meiji Bish had noticed the day before. Police created composite sketches based on these observations, but no identification followed. The lack of solid evidence frustrated investigators and the Bish family alike. Magi and John Bish became relentless advocates for their daughter. They participated in press conferences, kept her name in the headlines, and pushed for resources to continue the search. They transformed their grief into action, ensuring that Molly's story reached as wide an audience as possible. As the days stretched into weeks, hope waned but never fully disappeared. Molly's image, bright-eyed and smiling, became emblematic of a family's anguish and a community's determination. Though leads continued to emerge, none produced a breakthrough. By the end of the summer, with no trace of Molly found, the active search efforts began to scale back. The command post at Coleman's Pond was dismantled. Law enforcement continued to investigate, but the case entered a new phase. One defined by waiting, wondering, and a lingering sense of unfinished urgency. For Molly's family, every day without answers deepened the ache of uncertainty. On June 9, 2003, nearly 3 years after Molly Bish disappeared, a hunter walking through the woods in Palmer, Massachusetts, noticed something unusual. The area, about 5 miles from Commons Pond, was a rugged wooded region near Whiskey Hill, known for being remote and difficult to access. The hunter reported what he found to the police. A search team was dispatched. Over the next few days, police began a meticulous search of the site. They discovered partial human remains, scattered and in advanced stages of decomposition. The scene was treated with extreme caution. Investigators collected bones, fragments of clothing, and other potential evidence from the forest floor. Nearby, they found pieces of a blue bathing suit and other items consistent with what Molly had been wearing the day she disappeared. The medical examiner's office began the process of identifying the remains. Dental records were used, along with an examination of the clothing and other physical indicators. On June 13, 2003, the authorities confirmed what many feared. The remains belonged to Molly Bish. The announcement marked a somber turning point. After 3 years of searching, the Bish family and the town of Warren finally had confirmation that Molly would not be coming home. The discovery, while devastating, also reignited efforts to solve the case. Investigators hoped that forensic evidence from the site might yield clues about what had happened. The terrain where Molly's remains were found presented challenges. It was a heavily wooded slope, exposed to years of environmental conditions. The passage of time had eroded much of the physical evidence. Wildlife activity and weather had likely further dispersed and damaged remains and artifacts. Despite this, law enforcement pressed on. The FBI's evidence response team and the Massachusetts State Police spent weeks carefully combing through the area. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search for additional remains or evidence. Investigators recovered nearly 80% of Molly's skeletal remains, a rare and difficult task after such a long period. Public reaction was immediate. Vigils were held in Warren and surrounding towns. News outlets revisited the timeline of Molly's disappearance. Her photograph appeared again on television and in newspapers, now accompanied by headlines announcing the tragic discovery. The Bish family held a memorial service, choosing to celebrate her life and renew their call for justice. With Molly's body found, the case officially shifted from a missing person investigation to a homicide. Detectives revisited previous tips, re-examined witness statements, and began developing new leads. The forest in Palmer was now a crime scene, but it held more questions than answers. Following the discovery of Molly Bish's remains, investigators renewed their efforts with intensified focus. With confirmation that Molly had been murdered, the Massachusetts State Police and other agencies reviewed the existing case files and analyzed new leads generated by the location of her body. One of the earliest persons of interest was Rodney Stanger, a Florida man with ties to central Massachusetts. He had lived near the area where Molly disappeared and had a history of violent behavior. Stanger moved to Florida shortly after Molly's disappearance and was later convicted of murdering his girlfriend in 2008. After that conviction, authorities looked more closely at his background. Stanger resembled the composite sketch created from the description of the man seen in the white car at Commons Pond. He was known to frequent fishing spots near Whiskey Hill, where Molly's remains were found. His criminal history and proximity to key locations made him a significant subject of inquiry, but no physical evidence linked him directly to the crime. Another name to emerge in the investigation was Gerald Battistoni, a convicted rapist who had been active in the area during the late 1990s and early 2000s. Battistoni had served prison time for sexual assaults involving minors. His name surfaced when an informant suggested a connection between him and Molly's case. Like Stanger, he matched the physical description of the man seen near Commons Pond. Investigators questioned him extensively, but again, no conclusive evidence tied him to Molly's abduction and death. The composite sketch, based on Maggie Bish's sighting of a suspicious man the day before her daughter vanished, remained central to the investigation. Over the years, the sketch was widely circulated and prompted numerous tips. Police reviewed hundreds of leads, some credible, many not, trying to match the likeness to known offenders or individuals with local ties. Despite considerable efforts, no one was conclusively identified as the man Magi saw. Law enforcement also considered individuals with a history of stalking or approaching young women in the area. Several cases of attempted abductions from nearby towns were examined for possible links. Though some incidents bore similarities, none provided a breakthrough. Throughout the years, police relied on evolving forensic technology to retest evidence. Items recovered from the site where Molly's remains were found, including fragments of clothing, were examined for DNA or trace materials. While some samples were tested using the latest techniques, the condition of the evidence, exposed to the elements for years, limited what could be recovered. Despite the challenges, authorities continued to send samples to advanced labs for further analysis. The investigation into Molly Bish's death has remained active. The Massachusetts State Police have repeatedly stated that they continue to pursue all credible leads. Over 2 decades after her disappearance, no one has been arrested or charged in connection with the case. Still, the identification of several potential suspects helped refine the investigation's direction, and authorities have maintained that new forensic advancements or a single reliable tip could eventually bring resolution. As investigators explored leads in the Molly Bish case, they noted striking similarities to an earlier unsolved crime from the same region: the disappearance and murder of 10-year-old Holly Pyranen. Holly vanished in August 1993 while visiting her grandparents in Sturbridge, Massachusetts, only about 20 miles from where Molly later disappeared. Holly had gone out with her brother to look at puppies at a neighbor's house, but never returned. Her remains were found 2 months later in a wooded area of Brimfield, Massachusetts. Molly Bish had a personal connection to the Pyranen case. After Holly's disappearance, Molly wrote a letter of support to Holly's family. She expressed sympathy and concern and was deeply affected by the case, which left a lasting impression on her. At the time, Molly was only 13 years old. The resonance between the two cases intensified when Molly herself disappeared 7 years later, prompting investigators to consider whether a single offender might be responsible for both crimes. Both cases involved young girls who vanished in rural areas during daylight. Each had been last seen in areas frequented by locals: Holly near her grandparents' home, Molly at a public swimming area. Both bodies were later discovered in wooded locations within close proximity to their points of disappearance. These patterns fueled speculation that the same person might have been involved. Over time, some persons of interest in Molly's case were also examined in relation to Holly's. Gerald Battistoni, for example, became a suspect in both investigations. He had a criminal history of violent offenses against young girls and had lived in the region at the time of both disappearances. His name was reportedly brought to investigators by an informant who believed Battistoni had knowledge of both crimes. Despite this, no direct evidence ever emerged linking him conclusively to either case. DNA evidence found near the location where Holly's body was discovered was tested multiple times over the years. In 2012, investigators publicly acknowledged that forensic evidence in Holly's case was being re-examined with updated technology. In 2021, further advancements in DNA analysis allowed authorities to identify items of interest. Yet, despite extensive testing and reanalysis, none of the results led to a definitive suspect. The potential link between the two cases remains a significant point of interest. Law enforcement has not ruled out the possibility of a connection, but they have never officially confirmed that the two murders were committed by the same individual. The parallels have fueled public interest and media coverage, often focusing on the disturbing similarities and the geographic closeness of the crimes. Families of both girls have continued to support one another. Shared grief and a desire for justice have forged a connection between the Bish and Pyranen families. They have appeared together at press events, advocated for improvements in investigative tools, and supported initiatives for child safety and public awareness. As of today, both cases remain unsolved. Investigators maintain open files on each, and efforts to compare and cross-reference forensic data continue. Whether the connection between Holly and Molly will eventually lead to a resolution remains uncertain, but the similarities between the two cases persist as one of the most compelling elements in the broader search for answers. In the years following the discovery of Molly Bish's remains, one of the most promising avenues for solving the case has been the advancement of forensic science. From the early 2000s to the present day, developments in DNA analysis, trace evidence processing, and genealogical technology have transformed how cold cases are investigated, including Molly's. When Molly's remains were recovered in 2003, investigators collected bone fragments, clothing remnants, and soil samples from the site. However, the passage of time and environmental exposure posed significant obstacles. Degradation of DNA and contamination from weather and wildlife made conventional analysis difficult. Still, some evidence was preserved for future testing as technology improved. By the 2010s, forensic labs began using more sensitive equipment capable of extracting DNA from smaller or more degraded samples. The Massachusetts State Police Crime Laboratory and private forensic firms retested items linked to Molly's case, including fabric and possible biological material. In multiple instances, advanced testing was used to attempt to retrieve profiles, though results were limited due to the compromised condition of the evidence. Parallel to DNA advancements was the emergence of forensic genealogy. High-profile cases solved through this method, like the Golden State Killer, showed the potential of matching DNA from crime scenes with public genealogy databases. In Molly's case, authorities considered applying this method if viable DNA could be extracted and uploaded to compatible systems. Any lead obtained from such comparisons would then be corroborated with traditional investigative methods. The investigation also benefited from new imaging and data analysis technologies. Enhanced photographic techniques allowed authorities to digitally re-examine old photographs and composites. A more accurate digital rendering of the composite sketch, based on Maggie Bish's account, was created and distributed again. This updated image generated new public interest and tips, but none led to a conclusive identification. Other forensic efforts included the testing of trace elements such as hair, fibers, and possible residue on the clothing recovered near the body. While testing was performed periodically as techniques evolved, most samples yielded inconclusive or degraded results. Still, investigators continued to store and re-evaluate these items with each new technological development. One key area of progress has been collaboration between state agencies and national databases. Molly's case has been submitted to the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CIODIS, as well as other national missing persons and unidentified remains databases. These tools allow cross-matching of DNA, fingerprints, and dental records from different jurisdictions, improving the chances of identifying connections across state lines. Public engagement has also played a role. As awareness of forensic breakthroughs increased, individuals with potential knowledge about the case came forward again, offering information in light of new methods. Investigators reassessed older witness statements to identify inconsistencies or areas where new forensic tools could be applied. Despite all these advancements, no definitive forensic link has yet been established to a suspect in Molly's murder. Still, authorities remain hopeful that a breakthrough could emerge. With continued progress in DNA sequencing and analysis, even degraded samples may one day yield a match. For the Bish family and investigators, technology offers a path to justice that remains open, if uncertain. In the aftermath of Molly Bish's disappearance and the subsequent discovery of her remains, her family became central figures in the movement for child safety and victim advocacy. John and Maggie Bish transformed their grief into a sustained campaign to ensure that Molly's memory would endure and that other families would be spared similar anguish. Soon after Molly's remains were found, the Bish family launched the Molly Bish Foundation. The organization focused on child safety, abduction prevention, and public awareness. It provided families with tools and resources, such as child identification kits, and partnered with law enforcement to educate communities. The Foundation's efforts extended throughout Massachusetts and beyond, helping to institutionalize safety protocols and outreach strategies. Meiji Bish, in particular, became a vocal advocate for missing children and victims' rights. She worked with legislators, testified at public hearings, and participated in national conferences on child safety. Her presence at these events served as a reminder of the ongoing impact of unsolved cases and the need for systemic improvements in how they are investigated and supported. In Molly's hometown of Warren, annual remembrance events and vigils became a tradition. Local schools and civic groups honored her memory with scholarship funds, safety initiatives, and volunteer work. A granite bench and memorial plaque were installed at Coleman's Pond, the site of her disappearance, turning a place of tragedy into one of remembrance and reflection. The Molly Bish Center for the Protection of Children and the Elderly was established at Anna Maria College in Paxton, Massachusetts. The center serves as a hub for research, advocacy, and education on issues related to missing persons and vulnerable populations. Through partnerships with law enforcement, legal experts, and social workers, the center continues to advance the mission of safety and justice. Public awareness remained a critical component of the Bish family's work. They frequently appeared in media interviews, documentary programs, and public service campaigns. By keeping Molly's story in the public eye, they hope to generate new leads and pressure officials to continue prioritizing the case. In addition to their advocacy, the Bish family has called for improvements in investigative practices. They supported expanded use of forensic databases, wider adoption of forensic genealogy, and the creation of more coordinated responses to missing person cases. Their efforts contributed to legislation aimed at standardizing how missing person reports are filed and investigated across jurisdictions. The Bish family also found solidarity with other families of missing or murdered children. They formed lasting relationships with the Bayrainen family and others who endured similar tragedies. Through these connections, they built a network of support and mutual advocacy, creating a louder, more persistent voice calling for change. 2 decades after Molly's death, the Bish family remains committed to finding answers. While the foundation has scaled back its operations, their advocacy continues. They believe that someone, somewhere, knows what happened, and that advances in technology, combined with continued public engagement, may one day lead to the truth. More than 2 decades after Molly Bish vanished from Coleman's Pond, her case remains officially unsolved. Despite extensive investigation, media attention, and repeated forensic testing, no one has been arrested or charged in connection with her abduction and murder. The investigation remains open under the jurisdiction of the Massachusetts State Police, who continue to review evidence and pursue new leads. Investigators periodically revisit the case files, hoping that new technologies or fresh tips might yield results. DNA testing remains a primary focus. While earlier tests were limited by the condition of the evidence, recent advances have renewed hope. Authorities have expressed optimism that improved sensitivity in forensic tools or access to larger genealogical databases could eventually produce a match. From time to time, new persons of interest emerge, often based on re-interviews, behavioral profiles, or new statements from informants. These leads are carefully scrutinized, though none have yet led to charges. The challenge remains the same: a crime committed in a short window of time, in an isolated area, with little physical evidence that survived the intervening years. The Bish family continues to seek justice. They remain in regular contacts with investigators and occasionally provide public updates through interviews or community events. In recent years, they have renewed their public appeals, asking anyone with information, even details that once seemed insignificant, to come forward. Their message emphasizes that it is never too late for the truth to emerge. In 2021, investigators confirmed they had submitted new items related to Molly's case for forensic retesting, sparking renewed media interest. Authorities did not disclose the exact nature of the evidence, but emphasized their commitment to using the latest technology. At the same time, they reiterated their openness to all credible tips and encouraged the public to remain engaged. Molly's memory continues to be honored in her community. The memorial at Coleman's Pond remains a quiet place of remembrance. Scholarships in her name support young students pursuing education, particularly in health and safety-related fields. Her legacy lives on not only in symbols and memorials, but also in the safety programs, legislative efforts, and advocacy movements sparked by her story. The case has also left a lasting impact on law enforcement procedures. It highlighted the importance of rapid response in missing person cases, improved coordination between agencies, and the need for better systems to track and share evidence. Lessons from the investigation have been used in training programs for officers and detectives across the country. While no final resolution has yet been reached, Molly Bish's case is not forgotten. Investigators, family members, and community advocates continue to believe that answers are possible. The combination of persistent effort, scientific progress, and public involvement has kept the case active, even as time passes. Molly's story remains a symbol of tragedy, yes, but also of resilience and determination. Her family's unwavering pursuit of truth, their contributions to child safety, and the continued engagement of the community underscore a belief that justice, though delayed, is still within reach. Kristen Deborah Modafferi was born on June 1, 1979, in Danbury, Connecticut, and raised in Charlotte, North Carolina. She was the second of 4 daughters in a close-knit family. Known for her curiosity, determination, and love for learning, Kristen was a standout student. She graduated from Providence High School in Charlotte, earning a National Merit Scholarship that enabled her to attend North Carolina State University. By 1997, Kristen was a rising sophomore in the university's rigorous chemical engineering program with a minor in industrial design. Though academically gifted, Kristen also possessed a creative side, evident in her interest in photography and writing. That summer, she planned to attend a photography course at the University of California, Berkeley, a decision that excited her and reflected her desire to explore the world beyond North Carolina. Kristen arrived in the San Francisco Bay Area just after her 18th birthday. She moved into a shared home on Jane Avenue in Oakland, a neighborhood with a mixed reputation. The residence, a 3-story house, had been advertised for student tenants. Kristen shared the house with several other young people, most of whom she had not met before moving in. The arrangement was temporary, just for the summer. To support herself financially, Kristen secured part-time work at Spinelli's coffee shop, located in the bustling Crocker Galleria in downtown San Francisco. The job was practical and social, allowing her to engage with the city while earning money for her living expenses and studies. Her schedule was busy. She worked shifts at the coffee shop and planned to attend photography classes at UC Berkeley, scheduled to begin shortly after her arrival. Kristen's parents kept in touch by phone, speaking to her regularly. In their calls, Kristen sounded upbeat, describing her work, her roommates, and her experiences navigating the Bay Area's public transit system. Though far from home, she seemed confident and ready to embrace the independence that came with living in a new city. Her parents noted that she was cautious and sensible, someone who avoided taking unnecessary risks. She had taken self-defense classes and had been raised to be aware of her surroundings. Despite Oakland's reputation, Kristen seemed comfortable in her neighborhood, and nothing in her conversations suggested she felt unsafe. Kristen's early weeks in California passed uneventfully. She worked, explored the city, and looked forward to the start of her class. She had plans to meet people, make new friends, and possibly stay longer in the Bay Area if the opportunity presented itself. Her time in San Francisco was supposed to be a formative experience, a summer of growth and adventure. But less than a month after she arrived, Kristen would vanish without a trace, leaving behind a series of unanswered questions and a mystery that remains unsolved decades later. Monday, June 23rd, 1997, began like any other workday for Kristen Modafferi. She arrived at Spinelli's coffee shop in the Crocker Galleria for her scheduled shift. Kristen was wearing a black Spinelli's t-shirt, green plaid pants, and carrying a dark JanSport backpack. It was a standard summer morning in downtown San Francisco, crowded and busy with the usual mix of commuters, tourists, and office workers. She was seen performing her duties normally and interacting politely with customers and co-workers. Her shift ended around 3 p.m. According to witnesses, Kristen mentioned she planned to visit Baker Beach that afternoon, possibly to take photographs. After clocking out, she was observed speaking with a blonde woman near the store's entrance. This woman has never been conclusively identified. The interaction appeared casual, and there was no indication of distress or urgency. Kristen left the coffee shop on foot, heading toward Market Street. She withdrew money from an ATM near the Embarcadero station. Surveillance cameras confirmed this transaction. The footage did not show anyone else with her at the time. She was not scheduled to return to work that week, and her photography class was set to begin the next day. She never arrived. No confirmed sightings of Kristen exist after she left the financial district. It is unclear whether she made it to Baker Beach. No photos were found on her camera that suggested she had visited the area. The weather that afternoon was fair, typical for a San Francisco summer, with cool fog likely rolling in near the coast. That night, Kristen did not return to her residence on Jane Avenue. Her roommates assumed she was staying with friends or exploring the city. Since they were not close and the house lacked a formal reporting system, no immediate action was taken. Over the next day, Kristen missed the first session of her Berkeley course. She did not call home, an unusual break from her regular communication with her parents. On Wednesday, June 25th, Kristen's father, Bob Modafferi, called Spinelli's after not hearing from her. He learned that she had not shown up for work since Monday and had failed to pick up her last paycheck. Concerned, her parents immediately flew to San Francisco. Upon arrival, they visited the Jane Avenue house and found Kristen's room undisturbed. Her clothes, toiletries, and suitcase were still there. Her bank account remained untouched, with no further withdrawals after June 23rd. The Modafferis contacted the Oakland Police Department, but due to Kristen being legally an adult and only missing for a short period, the case did not initially receive high priority. Frustrated by the lack of urgency, the family hired private investigators and launched a campaign to find their daughter. Flyers were distributed across the Bay Area, and local media began to cover the disappearance. The last confirmed time anyone saw Kristen Modafferi was around 3 p.m. on June 23, 1997. Her case would soon draw national attention as search efforts intensified and troubling clues began to surface. In the days following Kristen Modafferi's disappearance, uncertainty and confusion defined the investigation's early phase. Her absence was initially downplayed by authorities, who noted that she was 18 and could legally leave on her own. Kristen's parents, Bob and Debbie Modafferi, pushed back against this assumption, stressing that Kristen was responsible, with no history of disappearing or withdrawing from commitments without explanation. At her Oakland residence, Kristen's bedroom offered no sign of forced entry or a struggle. Her suitcase, clothes, and toiletries were undisturbed. Her bank card had not been used since she withdrew money on June 23rd. Her unclaimed final paycheck from Spinelli's remained in the store's safe, further suggesting she had not planned to leave permanently. The Modafferi family hired private investigator Harold Hal Lipset, a former San Francisco police officer, to supplement the investigation. Lipset began reconstructing Kristen's movements in the hours before she vanished, canvassing downtown San Francisco and speaking to store employees and passers-by near the Crocker Galleria. While there were no clear leads, some witnesses recalled seeing Kristen speaking to an unknown blonde woman after her shift. Meanwhile, Kristen's parents placed missing person posters throughout the Bay Area. Media coverage expanded, and local news stations aired appeals from her family. Police eventually began to take the case more seriously. Though jurisdictional complications, Kristen lived in Oakland but worked in San Francisco, created delays in information sharing between departments. Attention turned to Kristen's daily routine. Her photography class at UC Berkeley was scheduled to start on June 24th, but she never attended. Administrators confirmed her enrollment and noted that tuition had been paid. Kristen had been excited about the class, discussing it with her parents in earlier calls. Her absence was viewed as completely out of character. At home, her roommates offered little insight. They said Kristen was quiet and independent, often spending time alone. She had not reported any issues or concerns to them. They noticed her absence but assumed she had found somewhere else to stay temporarily. As days passed, suspicion grew around the house, with some observers noting the lack of urgency shown by those living there. Investigators began to examine Kristen's room for clues. Among her belongings, they found a personal ad torn from a Bay Guardian newspaper. It appeared to reference a group or event, possibly connected to spiritual or social gatherings, though no direct link to her disappearance was established at that time. This detail was kept from the public in the early stages of the investigation. Despite their exhaustive efforts, the Modafferi family found themselves at a standstill. By the end of June, no one had come forward with definitive information. The tip line received sporadic calls, most of them unsubstantiated. Police released a public description of Kristen and asked anyone who had seen her after June 23rd to come forward. Few credible leads emerged. Each day that passed without answers only deepened the mystery. The first crucial 48 hours had come and gone without action, and now, nearly a week later, Kristen Modafferi was officially a missing person, with no evidence pointing clearly to where she might have gone, or who might have been with her. With pressure mounting from the Modafferi family and media coverage increasing, authorities expanded the search for Kristen. By early July 1997, the San Francisco Police Department, Oakland Police Department, and various private investigators were actively involved. The focus shifted to building a timeline of Kristen's final known movements and identifying potential witnesses who might offer clarity. Investigators brought in search dogs trained to detect human scent. One of the most notable developments came when bloodhounds traced Kristen's trail from the Crocker Galleria. The dogs followed her scent west through the city, eventually leading to Sutro Heights Park, a coastal overlook near the Cliff House restaurant. This location was several miles from downtown and would have required multiple transit connections or a lengthy walk. No one had seen her board a bus, train, or cab en route to that area. The area was searched extensively. Volunteers and police combed the surrounding trails and shoreline. Kristen's parents visited the location, trying to understand why their daughter might have gone there alone. Despite the effort, no personal items, clothing, or definitive physical evidence was discovered. Back at Kristen's Oakland residence, investigators revisited the shared house on Jane Avenue. They interviewed her housemates again, though none claimed to have seen her after the morning of June 23rd. Her roommates said she had mentioned going to Baker Beach, but did not know with whom she might have gone. Several of Kristen's belongings, including her backpack and camera, were not located in the room. Their absence suggested she had taken them with her, consistent with her plans for a photography outing. Investigators reviewed Kristen's call logs and bank records. The last confirmed activity was her ATM withdrawal downtown. No outgoing calls or bank transactions occurred afterward. Authorities subpoenaed phone and internet records from the home, though access was limited at the time, and any digital trace was minimal by modern standards. Kristen had sent a postcard to her parents the previous week, upbeat in tone and full of enthusiasm for the opportunities ahead. Attention returned to the torn personal ad found in Kristen's room. It appeared to reference a gathering or group and included a partial phone number. Police followed this lead, but found no connection to any known organizations or individuals of interest. The significance of the ad remained uncertain, and without context from Kristen herself, investigators could not determine its relevance. By mid-July, posters with Kristen's photo were visible across the Bay Area. Flyers were distributed on public transit, in coffee shops, libraries, and college campuses. The family appeared on local TV stations, pleading for information. Tip lines received dozens of calls, but most led nowhere. The public's interest was growing, yet solid leads remained elusive. Kristen's disappearance stood out. She was a responsible, bright young woman with no history of running away. There were no signs of mental health issues or criminal activity. She had clear plans and had just begun what was supposed to be a life-changing summer. Law enforcement categorized the case as a suspicious missing person, but without physical evidence, it remained classified as non-criminal. Investigators knew that time was critical, and as days turned into weeks, they feared opportunities to recover. Meaningful clues were slipping away. In late July 1997, a tip came in that would temporarily shift the focus of the investigation. A man named John Onuma contacted KGO-TV in San Francisco, claiming to have knowledge about Kristen Modafferi's disappearance. He alleged that Kristen had been murdered by two women over a dispute, and that her body had been disposed of under a bridge. The tip was immediately passed to law enforcement. Authorities began looking into Onuma's background. He was a 36-year-old man who lived in the San Francisco area with his girlfriend, Jill Lampo. Further investigation revealed that Onuma had a history of filing false reports and using aliases. Police soon discovered that he had made the accusation against the two women who worked at a local nightclub as an act of revenge because they had allegedly harassed his girlfriend. The two women named by Onuma were questioned. Both denied any involvement and provided solid alibis. The investigation found no link between them and Kristen. The location Onuma claimed was the body disposal site was searched thoroughly. Nothing of significance was found. Authorities determined that the story was fabricated. Onuma later admitted to making the tip up. Despite the falsehood, the Onuma lead prompted renewed scrutiny of Kristen's case. It raised questions about how information was being vetted and why someone would insert themselves into an open investigation in such a deceptive manner. For the Modafferi family, it was a painful and frustrating detour. Publicizing the lead had stirred hopes that were quickly dashed. John Onuma's actions drew widespread criticism. He was not arrested or charged at the time, as his actions did not meet the legal threshold for obstruction of justice or criminal mischief. Investigators continued to monitor him, and his behavior remained erratic. Despite multiple interviews, he offered no credible details that linked him to Kristen or to any relevant person or location. The incident underscored a major challenge in missing person cases, separating fact from fiction. Investigators must assess each tip while managing limited resources. In Kristen's case, the false lead consumed time and diverted attention away from potentially useful avenues of inquiry. Though ultimately dismissed, the Onuma tip was significant in how it shaped the investigation's tone. It highlighted the public's fascination with the case and showed how misinformation could enter the narrative. The Modafferi family, already struggling with unanswered questions, found themselves facing not just uncertainty, but the added burden of misdirection. As the summer wore on, credible leads became scarcer, posters faded, the media cycle began to shift to other stories. Yet the family pressed on. They met with law enforcement daily, reviewed case files, and continued to work with private investigators. They believed someone out there had information, and that the right tip could still surface. The false lead had shaken confidence in the process, but the core question remained: what really happened to Kristen Modafferi on June 23, 1997? Kristen Modafferi's temporary residence at 274 Jane Avenue in Oakland became a central focus of the investigation. The three-story house, located in a residential neighborhood near Lake Merritt, was a shared living space occupied by several tenants. Kristen had found the listing through a campus bulletin board and moved in just days after arriving in the Bay Area. The arrangement was informal, typical of student summer housing, with minimal oversight and short-term leases. The house was managed by a woman who lived off-site. It was divided into rooms rented individually, with a communal kitchen and bathroom. At the time of Kristen's disappearance, 4 other people lived in the building. Among them were a man in his 20s and a woman in her 30s, both with reportedly transient lifestyles. None of the housemates knew Kristen well. She had only lived there for about 3 weeks and, according to their accounts, kept to herself, and was often away during the day. After Kristen went missing, investigators examined the residence thoroughly. Her room appeared undisturbed. Her clothes were neatly folded, her toiletries lined up in the bathroom, and her bed made. The only items missing were those she likely had with her on June 23rd: her backpack, wallet, and camera. There was no sign of a struggle or forced entry. Neighbors did not report hearing anything unusual that day. Police interviewed the other tenants. Their recollections varied, but none claimed to have seen Kristen return home after leaving for work. Some said they assumed she had gone to stay with friends or found other accommodations in San Francisco. While none were declared suspects, authorities noted the strange dynamic within the house. Relationships among the tenants were distant, and background checks revealed minor past infractions among some residents. The location of the house also posed challenges. While it was close to public transit, the neighborhood had seen its share of crime. Reports of theft, drug activity, and occasional violence were not uncommon. It raised the question of whether Kristen may have encountered danger near her home, possibly from someone familiar with the area, or even from someone who knew her movements. A cadaver dog team was brought to the house weeks later. No immediate alerts were made at that time, and police did not report finding any forensic evidence inside the property. However, the basement level and the shared spaces were considered difficult to search fully due to clutter and disrepair. Kristen's parents visited the house during the early stages of the search, describing the setting as unsettling and chaotic. Despite their efforts, they found no answers there. Years later, new interest would return to Jane Avenue, but in the summer of 1997, the house was simply a mystery, an ordinary building that might have been the last place Kristen called home. With no eyewitnesses, no physical evidence, and no confirmed sightings after she left work, investigators were left with few solid leads. The Jane Avenue house stood as a symbol of Kristen's independent spirit and the fragile nature of her brief time in California. It was a place of transition, meant to be a stepping stone. Instead, it became a focal point in a case that refused to yield its secrets. Nearly 2 decades after Kristen Modafferi's disappearance, new efforts emerged to re-examine the case using advanced forensic technology. In 2015, the Modafferi family collaborated with private forensic experts to reinvestigate areas associated with Kristen's last known whereabouts, focusing particularly on the Jane Avenue house. Although law enforcement had searched the property in 1997, no conclusive evidence had been found at the time. The renewed interest was driven by Paul Dosty, a retired police officer and expert in cadaver dog investigations. Dosty had developed a reputation for using trained dogs to detect trace amounts of human decomposition in cold cases. With permission from the property's current residents, Dosty brought his cadaver dog, Buster, to search the Jane Avenue basement, yard, and surrounding areas. During the search, Buster alerted multiple times in the basement area. The alerts were strong enough to prompt further testing. Samples were collected from the soil and wood beneath the house. These were later sent to a specialized laboratory for analysis. The testing focused on detecting volatile organic compounds, VOCs, that indicate the presence of human decomposition. The samples were analyzed by Dr. Arpad Vass, a forensic anthropologist known for his work in human decomposition chemistry. Dr. Voss used proprietary methods to examine the compounds found in the samples. His results were striking, indicating the presence of decomposition consistent with human remains in the basement area, specifically under the concrete. In addition to chemical analysis, trace DNA testing was performed on some of the material collected. The results were partial, but included a mitochondrial DNA sequence that could not exclude Kristen Modafferi as a contributor. The Modafferi family provided reference samples, allowing for comparison. While not conclusive proof, the findings were significant and renewed interest in the location. Despite the forensic advancements, the Oakland Police Department did not immediately act on the findings. The property was still occupied, and access was limited, while the Modafferis urged authorities to conduct a full excavation. Official permission and legal warrants were complex and time-consuming. The evidence, while compelling, was circumstantial without the recovery of a body or other direct link. The discoveries reignited public attention. Media outlets covered the forensic developments, and experts weighed in on the implications. The question loomed: had Kristen been harmed in the very house where she had lived that summer? And if so, why had this gone undetected for so long? The basement and foundation of the Jane Avenue house remained a focus, but no excavation was ordered. Some advocates pushed for further investigation, while others cautioned that the results were suggestive, not definitive. Still, for the first time in years, there was a tangible clue, one that hinted at a possible location and offered the hope of resolution. The Modafferi family remained steadfast, calling for action and pressing authorities to revisit the site with urgency. They believed that science had brought them closer to the truth and that further analysis could finally answer what had happened to their daughter on that fateful June day. Following the 2015 cadaver dog alerts at Kristen Modafferi's former residence, Dr. Arpad Vass conducted a detailed forensic analysis that deepened the intrigue surrounding the case. Voss, an authority in the field of forensic anthropology and decomposition chemistry, was brought in to interpret the data collected from the Jane Avenue property. His analysis added a critical layer to the findings already uncovered by Paul Dostie and his cadaver dog. Using advanced tools developed from his research at the University of Tennessee's Body Farm, Voss tested samples from the basement. These samples had previously triggered the cadaver dog's alerts. His work focused on isolating and identifying specific volatile organic compounds, VOCs, that are only produced during the decomposition of human remains. According to Voss, the chemical signature found in the soil under the house was highly consistent with human decomposition. The implications were serious. Voss concluded that the concentration and profile of the compounds detected could not be easily explained by other environmental factors or contamination. He reported that the evidence suggested a human body had decomposed in that space. While no bones or tissue were recovered, the forensic chemistry pointed toward an event that had likely gone unnoticed for years. In addition to chemical testing, DNA analysis was conducted on material extracted from the same area. Though degraded and partial, mitochondrial DNA was isolated and compared to samples provided by Kristen's parents. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited maternally, does not provide a unique individual match, but can confirm maternal lineage. The sequence matched Kristen's maternal DNA, meaning the sample could not exclude her as the source. These findings reignited interest in the property, particularly the basement where the alerts and samples originated. Forensic experts advocated for further investigation, including potential excavation of the basement floor to search for human remains or other evidence. However, local authorities remained cautious. The Oakland Police Department stated that the evidence was not sufficient to justify the disruption or legal risks of a full-scale dig, especially on private property still in use. Voss defended his conclusions in public forums, emphasizing that the science behind his results was well documented. He expressed frustration that more action was not being taken, given the strength of the forensic indicators. To him, the findings represented the best lead in the case since Kristen had vanished in 1997. The Modafferi family was devastated by the results, but also encouraged. For years, they had lived without any concrete evidence. Now, they had the first scientific indication that their daughter may have died in the very house where she last lived. The possibility was heartbreaking, but it offered a path forward. Despite repeated calls for further investigation, no new searches were conducted in the years immediately following the analysis. The case remained officially unsolved, but for many observers, the combination of canine alerts, chemical markers, and mitochondrial DNA formed a compelling case for renewed forensic work. Still, without a body or criminal evidence, the investigation could not proceed beyond its current status. The basement at 274 Jane Avenue held secrets that science had only begun to uncover. Whether those secrets would ever be fully revealed remained uncertain. From the earliest days of Kristen Modafferi's disappearance, media coverage played a pivotal role in shaping public awareness and keeping the case in the spotlight. Her story was covered by local newspapers and television stations almost immediately after her parents arrived in California. The early attention helped amplify the family's search efforts and brought national focus to a case that might otherwise have gone overlooked. Within weeks of Kristen's disappearance, her photo and story appeared on missing persons posters throughout the Bay Area. Flyers were distributed on college campuses, at bus stops, and in shopping centers. The Modafferi family gave interviews to local news outlets, appealing directly to the public for help. Their emotional pleas resonated with many, particularly because Kristen was a bright young student with no history of trouble. Kristen's case soon caught the attention of national media. She was featured on the long-running television program Unsolved Mysteries, which devoted a segment to her disappearance. The show presented a timeline of events and included interviews with her parents and private investigators. The episode generated new tips, although none led to a breakthrough. In subsequent years, her case was profiled on Primetime Live and America's Most Wanted, both of which brought renewed attention. These appearances often coincided with anniversaries of her disappearance or new developments in the investigation. Viewers across the country were introduced to Kristen's story, and the exposure kept the case alive in the public consciousness. Despite the media attention, investigators struggled to manage the flood of tips. Some were credible, but many were not. False leads, like the one from John Onuma, consumed resources and shifted focus away from promising avenues. Still, the Modaferras believed the media was essential to their daughter's case. Without it, they feared Kristen's disappearance would be forgotten. As digital media grew in the 2000s, Kristen's story spread online. Blogs, discussion forums, and later social media platforms became places where amateur sleuths and concerned citizens revisited the case. Some online users speculated about her housemates, while others focused on inconsistencies in the original investigation. The Modafferi family monitored these discussions cautiously, occasionally engaging when appropriate. Over time, the case became a fixture among unsolved mystery enthusiasts. Podcasts and true crime programs featured Kristen's story, analyzing the facts and exploring theories. Each retelling brought in a new audience, ensuring that Kristen's name and image continued to circulate widely. Some programs reached out to the family directly, seeking updates and personal reflections. Despite the volume of attention, none of the media exposure resulted in a confirmed sighting or arrest. Still, it maintained public interest and served as a tool for advocacy. It also provided a platform for the Modafferi family to raise awareness about the broader issue of missing young adults, especially in large urban areas. By the late 2010s, Kristen's case had been profiled dozens of times, yet the outcome remained unchanged. The story continued to resonate not because of sensational details, but because it struck a chord, an ordinary young woman with a bright future, vanishing without explanation in a city filled with people. The mystery endured, and the media ensured that Kristen's name would not be forgotten. Kristen Modafferi's disappearance in 1997 not only launched a major investigation, it also inspired legislative change aimed at supporting families of missing adults. In the years following her disappearance, her parents became vocal advocates for reform, believing that law enforcement procedures at the time were inadequate for handling adult missing person cases. One of the major obstacles they encountered was the initial reluctance by police to treat Kristen's case as urgent. Because she was legally an adult and had not been missing for an extended period, authorities initially classified her absence as non-suspicious. This delay frustrated the Modafferis, who were convinced something serious had occurred. They argue that being over 18 should not automatically preclude a rapid response, especially when circumstances were clearly out of character. Their advocacy contributed to the development of Kristen's Law, a federal bill designed to address the unique challenges faced by families of missing adults. Sponsored in part by Senator Mike DeWine of Ohio, the legislation was introduced in the wake of increasing public concern over adult disappearances. The law was formally enacted in 2000. Kristen's Law authorized the U.S. Department of Justice to issue grants to organizations that assisted in locating missing adults. These funds were used to support the creation of a national clearinghouse for missing adult cases and to provide assistance with outreach, search coordination, and data collection. The goal was to create an infrastructure similar to the existing systems for missing children. The law had bipartisan support and was seen as a step forward in bridging the gap between missing children protocols and those for adults. It recognized that not all adult disappearances were voluntary, and that rapid intervention could make a difference in resolving cases. For families like the Modafferi's, the law offered validation and resources that had been previously lacking. Kristen's law remained in effect for several years, with funding allocated to various nonprofit and law enforcement agencies. Organizations such as the National Center for Missing Adults benefited directly, using the support to expand services and maintain national databases. However, in the late 2000s, federal appropriations for the program began to decline. By 2011, funding for Kristen's Law was discontinued, and the programs it supported were scaled back or merged with other initiatives. While the infrastructure it helped build continued to exist in some form, the law itself was not reauthorized. Still, its legacy endured in the awareness it raised and the policies it influenced. For Kristen's parents, the law was both a tribute and a tool. It ensured that their daughter's name became a symbol of change. Even as her case remained unsolved, Kristen's story contributed to systemic improvements in how missing adult cases were handled across the country. The legislation reminded the public and officials alike that adults too can be vulnerable, and that every missing person deserves attention, regardless of age. Though Kristen's Law eventually expired, its impact resonated with families facing the same uncertainty the Modafferi's had experienced so many years earlier. For more than 2 decades, the Modafferi family has remained unwavering in their search for answers about Kristen's disappearance. From the moment they arrived in California in June 1997, they have pursued every possible lead, navigated bureaucratic obstacles, and fought to keep Kristen's case from fading into obscurity. In the early days, Bob and Debbie Modafferi organized an extensive search operation across the Bay Area. They walked the streets of San Francisco and Oakland, distributing flyers and speaking to anyone who might have seen their daughter. They worked with private investigators, most notably Hal Lipset, who helped gather information when official channels were slow to act. The family created a toll-free tip line, ran newspaper ads, and established a website dedicated to Kristen's case. They hoped that someone, somewhere, might recall a detail that could lead to a breakthrough. Over the years, hundreds of tips came in, some sincere, others misleading, but none that brought definitive answers. They also traveled back and forth between North Carolina and California regularly, attending meetings with law enforcement and conducting interviews with local media. Despite repeated promises, the family often encountered a lack of coordination between agencies. Oakland and San Francisco police departments shared jurisdiction, creating delays in communication and decision-making. The Modafferi's have been deeply involved in every stage of the investigation. When forensic developments emerged in 2015, they helped coordinate testing, submitted DNA samples, and lobbied local authorities to take action. They expressed frustration at the slow pace of follow-up and urged investigators to pursue excavation of the Jane Avenue residence. Public advocacy became a cornerstone of their mission. Kristen's parents used media interviews not only to share updates on the case, but to highlight the challenges other families of missing adults face. They supported legislation like Kristen's Law and worked with other families in similar situations, forming a small but determined network of advocates. Despite the years that have passed, the family has never declared Kristen deceased. they continue to hold out hope for answers, if not resolution. Each anniversary is marked by renewed efforts, whether through social media campaigns, outreach to cold case units, or interviews with journalists revisiting the case. In interviews, Bob Modafferi has spoken often of the emotional toll, the strain of not knowing, the agony of unanswered questions, and the constant replaying of what-ifs. Yet he and Debbie remain committed to their daughter's memory. They have preserved her letters, photographs, and college belongings. These items, along with their advocacy, keep her presence alive. For them, the pursuit is not only about justice but also about remembrance. Kristen was more than a missing person. She was a daughter, a sister, a student, and a young woman with a life full of promise. The family's dedication has ensured that her story remains in the public consciousness. As they continue to seek the truth, the Modafferis have become a symbol of persistence. They've shown that behind every missing person's case is a family forever altered, striving to bring one of their own back home. As of 2025, Kristen Modafferi's case remains officially unsolved. Despite extensive efforts by family, private investigators, and law enforcement, no arrests have been made, and Kristen has not been found. She is still listed as a missing person by the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, and her file remains open with the Oakland Police Department. Over the years, various leads have surfaced, but none have yielded the resolution the Modafferi family has long sought. The cadaver dog alerts and forensic findings at the Jane Avenue residence in 2015 marked the most significant development in recent memory, yet no excavation has been approved. The property is still privately owned, and no legal action has compelled a renewed search. Police officials have periodically stated that the case is not closed and that any credible new information will be pursued. However, with the passage of time, active investigation has slowed. The original investigators have retired or moved on, and the case has transitioned into the hands of cold case specialists who revisit the file as resources permit. Kristen's disappearance continues to attract public interest, especially within online communities focused on unsolved cases. Her name is frequently mentioned in forums, podcasts, and true crime publications. Documentaries and social media profiles occasionally revisit the timeline of events, hoping that renewed exposure might trigger a long overdue tip. The Modafferi family maintains contact with advocates and volunteers, some of whom have dedicated years to researching Kristen's case. These efforts include coordinating with forensic experts, following up on rumors, and advocating for policy changes that support long-term investigations. Their persistence has ensured that Kristen's case remains visible even decades after she vanished. Despite the lack of resolution, Kristen's story continues to be a reference point in discussions about how missing adult cases are handled. She is often cited in law enforcement training and in media reports covering similar disappearances. The lessons learned from her case have influenced protocols for investigating adult missing persons, including quicker responses and broader information sharing. Public memory of the case endures. Each June, friends and supporters post messages remembering Kristen. The family continues to commemorate her birthday and the anniversary of her disappearance. Though time has passed, the pain of not knowing remains as sharp as ever. The unanswered question of what happened to Kristen on June 23, 1997, still haunts those who knew her and those who have come to know her through her story. The Modafferis remain committed to finding out the truth. For them, closure is not just about accountability, it's about bringing Kristen home. Until that day comes, they vow to continue searching, asking questions, and turning over every possible stone. Kristen Modafferi was 18 years old when she vanished in San Francisco. Today, her memory persists not only in the hearts of her loved ones, but also in the ongoing effort to seek answers for her and for every family that waits in silence for a loved one who never returned. Jessica Marie Lunsford was born on October 6, 1995, in Gastonia, North Carolina. By the age of 9, she was living with her father, Mark Lunsford, and grandparents Archie and Ruth Lunsford in Homosassa, a small unincorporated community in Citrus County, Florida. Jessica, known as Jessie to her loved ones, was described by those who knew her as a bright, friendly, and caring young girl with a love for pink clothing and a constant smile. She attended Homosassa Elementary School, where she was a third-grade student and well-liked by her classmates and teachers. On the evening of February 23, 2005, Jessica went through her usual bedtime routine. Her father had put her to bed in the room she shared with her grandparents. Nothing in the household seemed out of the ordinary. Mark Lunsford left for work early in the morning on February 24th, and by the time Ruth went to wake Jessica, she was gone. Her bed was empty, and there were no immediate signs of struggle. The screen on her bedroom window was disturbed, but nothing else was obviously amiss. The front door of the house remained locked. Panic set in quickly, and a call to 911 was placed that morning to report Jessica missing. Within hours, the Citrus County Sheriff's Office initiated a large-scale search. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, including the trailer homes nearby, and coordinated with volunteers to cover the surrounding areas. Helicopters flew overhead, and search dogs were brought in. News of the missing child traveled fast, gaining attention from both local and national media. Flyers bearing Jessica's picture and description were distributed across town, and roadblocks were set up in an effort to catch any possible leads. Jessica's disappearance struck a deep nerve in the quiet Homosassa community. Residents joined law enforcement in the search efforts, and the family received an outpouring of support. Mark Lunsford, in particular, became a central figure in the public appeal for information. He appeared on several news programs, asking anyone with knowledge of his daughter's whereabouts to come forward. Despite the mobilization, days passed with no solid clues as to where Jessica had gone or who might have taken her. Investigators looked into Jessica's family and their acquaintances, conducting interviews and background checks. No immediate suspects emerged. The lack of physical evidence and the absence of a clear motive made the case particularly challenging. Jessica had no known enemies, and the area where she lived, though not without its problems, had not experienced anything similar in recent memory. As the days stretched into weeks, law enforcement continued to work behind the scenes, maintaining pressure on the case. They began to re-interview residents of the neighborhood and run checks on individuals with prior criminal records. Among those living just yards away from the Lunsford home was a 46-year-old man named John Coey, residing in a small trailer with relatives. He had not initially been a focal point in the investigation. At the time, the Lunsford family had no reason to suspect that danger lurked so close. Their grief was deepening by the day, worsened by the silence and uncertainty. Homosassa, once a quiet retreat along Florida's west coast, had become the epicenter of a desperate search that was now entering its second week. As the investigation intensified, the Citrus County Sheriff's Office organized one of the largest search efforts in the county's history. Detectives, deputies, volunteers, and specialized units formed a coordinated strategy to comb through Homosassa and its surroundings. They searched forests, vacant buildings, and retention ponds. Canines trained in scent detection were deployed to follow any potential trails, while forensic teams re-examined Jessica's bedroom for new clues. The media presence grew rapidly. Major television networks covered the case, and Jessica's picture, brown-haired, bright-eyed, and smiling, was shown on screens nationwide. Law enforcement used Amber Alerts, billboards, and digital displays to spread the word. Mark Lunsford and other family members held regular press conferences, their pleas growing more desperate as time went on. They spoke directly to the unknown abductor, asking for Jessica's safe return. Tips flooded the sheriff's office. Every lead, whether credible or speculative, was pursued. Some tips led to searches in other parts of Florida. Others prompted interviews with individuals with criminal records or known histories of child-related offenses. The FBI joined the investigation, bringing additional resources and personnel. Despite the effort, investigators were troubled by the lack of physical evidence. There were no witnesses, no confirmed sightings, no fingerprints or DNA that pointed definitively to a suspect. The screen from Jessica's window was collected and tested, and the family home was repeatedly examined for signs of forced entry. Interviews revealed that no one had seen anything suspicious on the night Jessica vanished. The search extended to registered sex offenders in the vicinity. Florida law required these individuals to be listed publicly, and the sheriff's office began contacting them one by one. In the trailer just across the street from the Lunsford home lived the Cooey family. John Cooey, a man with a criminal record including burglary and child molestation charges, resided there with relatives. Deputies first visited the residence early in the investigation, but Cooey was not at home during that visit. Cooey's name surfaced again when detectives compiled a comprehensive list of nearby offenders. A second visit was made to the trailer, and he was interviewed briefly by officers. At the time, he appeared cooperative and did not raise immediate suspicion. His background was noted, but there was no hard evidence tying him to the disappearance. Meanwhile, the Lunsford family clung to hope. Jessica's grandfather stayed active in the search, while her father worked closely with media outlets to keep her face and name in the public eye. Days passed, then weeks. Candlelight vigils were held, and a temporary command post was set up near the home. Local residents, shaken by the disappearance, kept their children close and added locks to their doors. The atmosphere in Homosassa changed. Fear had replaced the usual calm. Despite the exhaustive efforts, the trail remained cold. The sheriff's office issued updates, but with little progress to report. Then, in early March, John Cooey abruptly left Florida and traveled to Georgia, a move that did not go unnoticed. Law enforcement issued a nationwide alert and began coordinating with agencies across state lines. Shortly after Cooey's departure, investigators obtained a warrant to search the trailer where he had been staying. Inside, they found items of interest, including a mattress and evidence that would later become key in the case. Forensic samples were collected and sent for testing. The results would take time, but detectives began to look at Cooey with growing suspicion. On March 17, 2005, John Cooey was arrested in Augusta, Georgia, on unrelated charges. Upon his arrest, he was interrogated by officers from both Florida and Georgia. During questioning, he made statements that led authorities to believe he had information about Jessica Lunsford. The breakthrough had come nearly a month after she vanished. As news of Cooey's arrest spread, hope flickered in the community that Jessica might still be found alive. Law enforcement moved quickly to extract as much information as possible. For the first time, there was a name and a face to associate with the mystery that had gripped Homosassa for weeks. John Evander Cooey was born on September 19, 1958, in Florida. His criminal history stretched back decades and included convictions for burglary, indecent exposure, and crimes against children. By 2005, Cui had served multiple prison sentences. He had failed to comply with registration requirements as a sex offender more than once. Despite his history, he was living with his half-sister Dorothy Dixon and other relatives in a small trailer on West Snowbird Court, just across the street from the Lunsford home. Following his arrest in Augusta, Georgia, investigators from Citrus County traveled to question Cui. He initially denied involvement in Jessica's disappearance. However, during extended interviews, conducted without the presence of an attorney and under unclear legal protocols, Cui made incriminating statements. He eventually confessed to abducting Jessica from her bedroom, holding her captive in his bedroom for several days, and ultimately killing her. In the confession, Cui described entering the Lunsford home through an unlocked door in the early morning hours of February 24th. He claimed he found Jessica awake and led her back to his trailer without waking anyone else in the household. Once there, he kept her hidden in his small room, instructing his relatives not to enter. The trailer was small, and the idea that a child had been concealed there without the knowledge of others would later become a point of legal and public scrutiny. Cui claimed that he tried to care for Jessica by feeding her and allowing her to watch television, but he admitted to sexually assaulting her during her captivity. He said he panicked when media attention intensified and law enforcement began searching the area. Fearing he would be caught, Cui told investigators he buried Jessica alive near the trailer, placing her in a plastic garbage bag before covering the hole with soil and debris. His confession led investigators to the location he described. On March 19, 2005, authorities uncovered the grave behind the trailer. Inside was a small decomposed body wrapped in 2 trash bags, bound with speaker wire. A stuffed dolphin toy and a pink blanket were found alongside her remains. Dental records confirmed the identity of Jessica Lunsford. The discovery confirmed the worst fears of her family and the community. News outlets broke the story, and grief swept through Homosassa. A memorial formed outside the Lunsford home, as residents left flowers, cards, and photographs in tribute. The family, who had held out hope, now faced the reality of Jessica's death under horrifying circumstances. The confession triggered immediate outrage, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but also due to the fact that Cui, a known sex offender, had been living so close to a young child without adequate monitoring. Critics pointed to systemic failures in sex offender tracking, especially in states like Florida, where enforcement varied by county. In Citrus County, Cui had slipped through the cracks. Although his name had appeared in early records, law enforcement had not initially flagged him as a primary suspect. Attention also turned to Cui's relatives. Dorothy Dixon and other residents of the trailer were questioned repeatedly. They denied knowing that Jessica had been inside the home. Legal analysts debated whether their lack of awareness was credible. The trailer's cramped conditions made it difficult to believe that Jessica had gone undetected for days, but no charges were filed against the family members. Cui was extradited to Florida and placed in custody. Public and legal attention now shifted to the prosecution phase. The community demanded swift justice. Jessica's father expressed deep frustration at how close Cui had been during the search and how long it took to identify him as the perpetrator. Lawmakers began to discuss reforms in sex offender laws, spurred by public outcry and national attention. The crime scene around the trailer was cordoned off, and additional forensic analysis was conducted. Evidence recovered included the mattress from Cui's room, items of clothing, and various biological samples. Forensic testing would later substantiate Cui's claims and tie him to the victim with DNA evidence. Kui's detailed confession, combined with physical evidence, painted a grim but clear picture of what had happened in the days after Jessica Lunsford disappeared. The story, once a mystery of a vanished child, had transformed into a documented case of kidnapping, rape, and murder committed by a neighbor hiding in plain sight. John Coey's confession to abducting, assaulting, and killing Jessica Lunsford was a turning point in the case, but it quickly became a matter of legal contention. Coey had been interrogated by law enforcement in Georgia without the presence of legal counsel. Although he had been read his Miranda rights, he waived them and agreed to speak with officers. His mental state, intellectual capacity, and the methods used during questioning soon came under scrutiny. Coey had a documented history of mental illness and low intelligence, with an IQ estimated in the 60s. His attorneys argued that he did not fully understand his rights, and that his confession was therefore involuntary. Legal experts debated whether the confession should be suppressed. The court held a series of hearings to determine its admissibility, which delayed the trial process. During the interviews in Augusta, Coey had spoken calmly and in detail about how he entered the Lunsford home, what he did afterward, and how he disposed of Jessica's body. He described taping her wrists and ankles, placing her in a closet, and covering the door with items to muffle sound. He claimed that he panicked when investigators came to the trailer and made the decision to kill her. Coey also explained the sequence of events that led him to dig a shallow grave behind the trailer. The defense contended that the confession had been coerced, noting that Coey was questioned for hours over several days, and that his requests for legal counsel were not adequately addressed. Prosecutors countered that the confession was both voluntary and consistent with the physical evidence found at the scene. They emphasized that Coey led investigators to Jessica's remains, a fact they said could not be dismissed. The court ultimately ruled that the confession itself would be inadmissible during the main trial. However, any evidence discovered as a direct result of the confession, such as the location of Jessica's body, would still be permitted. This ruling created a unique legal situation where the jury would not hear the most damning verbal admissions from the defendant, but would see the results of what he had disclosed. Forensic analysis supported the prosecution's case. DNA found on the mattress and other items from the trailer matched Jessica's and Coey's profiles. The medical examiner confirmed that Jessica had died from asphyxiation and had been buried alive. The report noted signs of sexual assault and determined that Jessica had likely survived for 3 days after her abduction. The public reaction to the exclusion of Coey's confession was swift and angry. Many saw it as a technicality that undermined justice. Mark Lunsford and other family members expressed frustration with the delays and legal maneuvering. Still, prosecutors moved forward, confident that the forensic evidence alone would be sufficient for a conviction. Meanwhile, Coey's background was examined further. Records showed that he had been released from prison just 2 months before Jessica's disappearance. He had violated probation in the past and failed to register his address properly as a sex offender. These lapses highlighted weaknesses in the monitoring system and became part of a broader discussion on how to prevent similar crimes. In preparation for trial, Coey was evaluated for competency. Psychologists found that he was capable of understanding the charges against him and assisting in his defense. Although his IQ placed him in the range considered intellectually disabled, the court concluded that he met the threshold for standing trial under Florida law. Defense attorneys raised concerns about his ability to receive a fair trial due to the widespread publicity the case had generated. Efforts to move the trial to another county were denied. The court took steps to screen jurors carefully, seeking individuals who could remain impartial despite the intense media coverage. Coey was formally charged with first-degree murder. kidnapping, sexual battery, and burglary. Prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty. As legal preparations moved forward, public interest in the case remained high. Advocacy groups began pushing for legislative reform, and Florida lawmakers introduced bills aimed at increasing penalties for sex offenders and improving tracking systems. The focus was no longer solely on Cooey's guilt. It was also on how to prevent another tragedy like Jessica Lunsford's. The discovery of Jessica Lunsford's remains behind the trailer where John Cooey lived brought the investigation into stark focus. Forensic teams descended on the property, carefully documenting the burial site and collecting every trace of evidence. The body had been interred in a small, crudely dug hole approximately 3 feet deep, concealed by debris and overgrown vegetation. The grave's proximity to the Lunsford residence, just yards away, deepened the community's sorrow and disbelief. Jessica's remains were found wrapped in 2 plastic garbage bags, her body still clothed in the pajamas she had worn the night of her disappearance. Her wrists were bound with speaker wire, and duct tape was recovered from the scene. Near her was a stuffed dolphin toy, later identified by her family as one of her favorite belongings. A small pink blanket was also discovered in the grave. The medical examiner's autopsy report confirmed the horrifying details. Jessica had been sexually assaulted and was alive for at least 3 days after being abducted. She died of mechanical asphyxia, consistent with being buried alive. Dirt was found in her airways, indicating that she had struggled to breathe inside the tightly sealed bags. The time between her abduction and death became a critical element in understanding the sequence of events. Forensic investigators processed Cowie's bedroom, which was small and cluttered, with a single mattress on the floor. The room had only one entrance, and investigators noted attempts to block sound from escaping, including the use of clothing and furniture. DNA samples were collected from the mattress and surrounding items. Semen stains found on the mattress matched Cooey's DNA. Hair and fiber evidence recovered from the trailer was also consistent with Jessica's profile. Luminol tests and alternate light sources were used to identify biological evidence not visible to the naked eye. The trailer yielded several areas of interest, including stains on walls and the floor that were sampled for further testing. Trace evidence helped reconstruct how Jessica may have been moved and where she had been kept during her captivity. The garbage bags used in the burial were traced to materials available in the home. Investigators also found gloves and digging tools nearby. The speaker wire used to bind Jessica matched wiring found in the trailer, linking the burial materials directly to Cooey's residence. Fingerprint analysis supported the conclusion that Cooey had handled the bags and tape. The evidence formed a cohesive narrative. Jessica had been abducted from her bedroom and held captive within 150 yards of her home, during a time when search teams had combed the area repeatedly. She was eventually killed and buried in secret, with only the killer aware of her location. The search perimeter had come close, but never breached the boundaries of Cooey's trailer in a meaningful way. Investigators also examined electronic and phone records, but Cooey did not appear to have used communication devices during the crime. He had kept a low profile and was aided, if unintentionally, by the limited oversight of sex offenders in the area. Interviews with his relatives confirmed that they had been told not to enter his room, a request that had not raised alarm until after his arrest. The condition of the remains made time of death estimation difficult, but forensic entomology and tissue analysis helped establish a probable timeline. This aligned with Cooey's confession, even though that confession was not admissible during the trial. Prosecutors relied heavily on the forensic evidence to build their case, knowing it would be the foundation of their argument to the jury. As evidence was presented in pre-trial hearings, the public became increasingly aware of the thoroughness of the investigation. Experts testified about the scientific methods used and how the physical findings correlated with known facts. Despite the absence of a usable confession, the case against Cooey grew stronger with each detail confirmed through lab testing. Jessica's funeral was held on March 24th, 2005, exactly 1 month after she was last seen. Thousands of mourners gathered, including local officials, schoolmates, and community members. Her casket was white, adorned with pink flowers and images of angels. The service was a public expression of grief and a stark reminder of the tragedy that had shaken Homosassa. The trial of John Cooey began in February 2007 in Miami, following a change of venue granted due to the intense pretrial publicity in Citrus County. The defense had argued that Cooey could not receive a fair trial in the county where Jessica lived and was abducted. A Miami-Dade County courtroom was chosen, and a jury was selected through a rigorous screening process aimed at ensuring impartiality. Cooey faced charges of first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual battery on a child under 12, and burglary of a dwelling with battery. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, asserting that the crime met the criteria for capital punishment under Florida law. The defense, while acknowledging the brutality of the crime, aimed to save Cooey from execution by emphasizing his mental disabilities. Because his confession had been ruled inadmissible, the prosecution relied on physical and forensic evidence. Witnesses included crime scene technicians, forensic scientists, the medical examiner, and members of law enforcement who had participated in the investigation. Their testimony laid out a detailed, scientific reconstruction of the crime, showing how the evidence pointed directly to Cooey. Jurors were shown photographs of the grave, the scene inside the trailer, and images from the autopsy. DNA evidence played a central role. Analysts testified that Cooey's DNA was found on the mattress where Jessica had been held, and that her DNA was found on items recovered from the trailer. The medical examiner described Jessica's cause of death and the condition of her body, reinforcing the prosecution's timeline. The defense focused on Cooey's cognitive limitations. Expert witnesses testified that his IQ ranged between 60 and 70, placing him within the threshold for intellectual disability. They argued that he did not possess the level of intent or understanding required for a death sentence under U.S. Supreme Court standards. However, the court had already ruled that he was competent to stand trial, and the jury was tasked with determining both guilt and whether aggravating factors outweighed mitigating ones. Throughout the proceedings, Mark Lunsford attended court daily. His presence reminded jurors of the human toll behind the evidence. The courtroom was often tense, with visible reactions from Jessica's family during the more graphic testimony. Media coverage remained high, with daily reports summarizing the trial's progress and public interest continuing across the country. After 3 weeks of testimony and 2 days of deliberation, the jury found Cooey guilty on all counts. The verdict was announced on March 7, 2007. The court then moved into the penalty phase to determine Cooey's sentence. Prosecutors argued that Cooey's actions were especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel, citing the prolonged suffering of the victim and the calculated nature of the crime. They pointed out that Cooey had multiple prior felony convictions and was a registered sex offender who had evaded proper supervision. The defense again presented evidence of Cooey's mental condition, arguing that execution would violate constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. They cited Supreme Court rulings that prohibited the execution of individuals with significant intellectual impairments. On March 14, 2007, the jury unanimously recommended the death penalty. the judge formally sentenced Cooey to death, along with 3 consecutive life sentences for the other convictions. In delivering the sentence, the court noted the particularly brutal circumstances of the crime and Cooey's disregard for human life. Following sentencing, Cooey was transferred to death row at Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida. He was placed in solitary confinement and denied further contact with the media. Appeals were anticipated, but the process would be cut short. On September 30th, 2009, Cooey died in prison of natural causes. He had been diagnosed with cancer and died before any appeals could be heard. His death brought a final, unceremonious end to a case that had haunted Florida for years. For Jessica's family, it marked the close of a legal chapter, but not the end of their grief or their mission. The trial had exposed significant gaps in how sex offenders were monitored and prosecuted. It also raised difficult questions about legal protections, mental capacity, and the administration of justice in the face of emotionally charged crimes. Jessica's memory continued to shape public discussion, not only as a symbol of tragedy, but also as a catalyst for change. The murder of Jessica Lunsford had a profound and immediate impact on public policy, particularly concerning sex offender laws in the United States. In the wake of her death, Florida lawmakers moved swiftly to draft and pass legislation aimed at tightening restrictions and increasing penalties for sex crimes against children. The result was the passage of what became widely known as Jessica's Law. On May 2, 2005, just over 2 months after Jessica's body was found, then-Governor Jeb Bush signed the Jessica Lunsford Act into law. The act significantly increased mandatory minimum sentences for individuals convicted of lewd or lascivious acts against children under the age of 12. Under the new law, offenders would face a minimum of 25 years to life in prison and mandatory lifetime electronic monitoring following release. One of the critical failings highlighted in Jessica's case was the lack of effective tracking of registered sex offenders. John Cooey, despite being a convicted offender, had been able to live near a child without oversight. Jessica's Law aimed to correct such gaps by introducing stricter residency requirements and closer monitoring of high-risk individuals. The law also expanded the use of Global Positioning System, GPS devices, to track the movements of released sex offenders. Florida's legislation served as a model for similar laws across the United States. Over the next several years, more than 40 states adopted versions of Jessica's Law. While the core provisions varied, most included increased prison terms and post-release monitoring. The laws were often passed with strong bipartisan support and public approval. The federal government also took steps to improve the National Sex Offender Registry. The Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act, signed into law in 2006, included provisions for standardizing registration and monitoring procedures across state lines. Jessica's case was cited during congressional debates as an example of the consequences of weak enforcement. Despite the widespread adoption of Jessica's Law, the legislation was not without criticism. Civil liberties groups and criminal justice reform advocates raised concerns about the long-term effectiveness of harsh mandatory minimums and lifetime GPS tracking. Critics argued that such laws could lead to overcrowding in prisons and disproportionate sentencing in less severe cases. They also noted that placing severe residency restrictions on offenders could drive them into homelessness or untraceable locations, undermining the goal of community safety. Nevertheless, the public sentiment overwhelmingly supported the changes. For many, the murder of a child in her own home by a nearby sex offender underscored a need for uncompromising safeguards. the legislation became part of a broader shift in American attitudes towards sexual violence and child protection, ushering in an era of zero tolerance. Mark Lunsford played a significant role in the push for legal reform. After Jessica's death, he became a vocal advocate for tougher sex offender laws. He traveled across the country, speaking before state legislatures, participating in public forums, and meeting with law enforcement agencies. His efforts were widely recognized, and he became the face of a national movement to protect children from predators. Lunsford also worked with advocacy groups to educate the public about the importance of awareness and prevention. His advocacy extended to supporting federal reforms and encouraging technological innovations in tracking and registering offenders. He frequently reminded audiences that the law was not just about punishment, but about preventing future tragedies. In Florida, the impact of Jessica's law was soon felt. Offender monitoring systems were upgraded, and coordination between local law enforcement and state databases improved. The number of unaccounted-for sex offenders dropped, and compliance checks became more routine. Jessica's case became a benchmark for measuring the effectiveness of reform. Media coverage of the legislation helped maintain public attention on the broader issue. News programs and documentaries highlighted Jessica's story, alongside updates on new laws being passed. While the emotional weight of the case contributed to rapid policy responses, the sustained advocacy helped ensure that reform efforts continued even after the initial headlines faded. Jessica's law marked a turning point in how the United States dealt with sex crimes against children. Though not without its challenges and complexities, it became a lasting part of Jessica's legacy, a legal and social framework shaped by the tragedy of her death, designed to protect others from a similar fate. In the years following Jessica Lunsford's death, her legacy took form through advocacy, policy, and remembrance. Her father, Mark Lunsford, transformed personal grief into a public mission. He founded the Jessica Marie Lunsford Foundation, aiming to prevent crimes against children through education, legislation, and support for victims' families. The foundation quickly became a national voice for child safety. Mark Lunsford traveled extensively, meeting with lawmakers, law enforcement, and community leaders. He worked to ensure that Jessica's law was not merely passed, but enforced. He lobbied for resources to support GPS monitoring, community notification systems, and rigorous background checks for individuals working with children. His testimony was often emotional, grounded in the lived experience of a parent whose child had been failed by the system. The foundation also focused on community outreach. It held safety seminars, distributed educational materials, and partnered with schools and civic organizations. Its goal was to empower families with tools to recognize threats and prevent abuse. Mark Lunsford frequently emphasized that prevention started with awareness and vigilance, not fear, but preparedness. Jessica's story was retold in numerous media formats, from television documentaries to news features. Her name became synonymous with child safety reform. While the coverage varied in tone, the central facts remained fixed. A child abducted from her home, kept within reach of rescuers, and murdered by a man known to the system but inadequately monitored. These facts continue to drive home the need for systemic change. Over time, tributes to Jessica appeared in various forms. Memorials were built, including a dedicated space near her elementary school. A tree was planted in her honor, a plaque installed, and local events held annually to remember her. Community members organized charity runs and fundraising events supporting child protection groups. These acts of remembrance served both as healing and as reminders of vigilance. In 2008, the Lunsford Foundation faced operational challenges and eventually reduced its public activity, but its influence endured. Mark Lunsford continued to advocate independently, often speaking at schools, corrections conferences, and victim rights panels. He maintained correspondence with families of other child victims, offering guidance and solidarity. Jessica's story became a touchstone in broader conversations about justice, prevention, and public safety. In the educational sphere, school programs adopted components inspired by the Foundation's work. Lessons on personal safety, stranger danger, and internet awareness were incorporated into elementary school curricula in parts of Florida and beyond. Organizations expanded their efforts to reach children through age-appropriate instruction on identifying and reporting abuse. Law enforcement agencies, influenced in part by Jessica's case, increased investments in technology and interagency communication. Sex offender registries became more centralized and accessible, and many jurisdictions strengthened compliance monitoring. Task forces formed to track down absconders and review registry gaps. Though challenges persisted, the commitment to improvement was evident. Academics studied the case to understand the impact of high-profile crimes on policy development. Some argued that Jessica's case exemplified crisis legislation, while others defended the rapid response as justified by systemic failures. Regardless of perspective, the consensus acknowledged the case's role in reshaping child protection policy in the early 21st century. Jessica's impact extended to cultural memory. Her name, photograph, and story continued to appear in discussions about justice and reform. Advocates used her case to explain the real-life stakes behind statistics and legislation. Parents cited her when demanding safer neighborhoods, stricter background checks, or faster response times to missing child reports. As the years passed, Homosassa slowly resumed its quiet rhythm. The trailer where Coe once lived was removed. The empty lot served as a grim reminder of what had happened, but also as a symbol of resilience. Jessica's family remained in the public eye at times, and always in the hearts of those who followed the case. Jessica Lunsford's life was short, but the effects of her story were lasting. Her memory helped alter laws, raise awareness, and mobilize action across the country. What began as a local tragedy became a national reckoning, and through the efforts of those who refused to let her be forgotten, Jessica's legacy lived on, not only in laws passed or memorials built, but in every measure taken to keep children safer from harm.